Good evening and welcome to the Heterodox History Podcast. Today we'll be discussing the Estado Novo, the new state, Portugal's pluricontinental autocracy under Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. I am very lucky to be joined by Hitman. Hello.
Hello, good evening. Should be a great conversation.
And Panama Hat.
It's wonderful to be back as always. Looking forward to this discussion very much.
Fantastic. Right. In terms of a brief plan of this evening, I'm going to inflict a copious amount of context on this stream and on the audience, because of course that's why you come to this channel. It's not to get a 3-minute overview of the Estado Novo or just the brief quote-unquote facts. It's to get the full picture of this momentous occasion in Portuguese history. And indeed, this is as much a tale of the rise and fall of the Portuguese Empire as it is about the uniqueness of this idea of the Portuguese dictatorship enduring throughout the 20th century. But before I get on to this idea of talking about just the Portuguese Empire in general and its history, I would like to ask both of you, because Antonio de Salazar is a rather obscure figure in English-speaking countries, and when one hears about him, it tends to be from the perspective that, oh, he's just another fascist, he was just another, hanger-on from the era before Hitler, etc., etc. Again, part of this, you can say, leftist tendency of fetishizing all of these, quote-unquote, quasi-fascist or fascist regimes. Of course, that is not my view, but I would like to get your original thoughts as to why you're interested in the Estado Novo and the autocracy of Salazar.
Well, I'll go first. Well, I've always actually been interested in Portuguese history. It's just one of the countries I just seem to really have an interest in. I think it's because being English, you've obviously got the Anglo-Portuguese alliance, and I don't know about you two, but there seems to be a little bit of a Lusophilia with English people, so maybe that could explain it. But I've always found the Portuguese Empire especially interesting, so that's one of the reasons. And it's because obviously I'm used Portugal's most of its history has been a monarchy, so seeing this regime that's not a monarchy sort of be even more, you could say, steadfastly imperialist out of any of them is what attracted me to it. And there's all these different parts of the sort of state ideology with, that, as we mentioned, with things like Lusotropicalism and pluricontinentalism, Catholic corporatism. It's all just very interesting mix, essentially, and that's what attracts me to it.
How about you, Panama?
I've always been interested in Portugal because, and I hope this doesn't sound like a kind of chauvinistic view, but it's one of these countries that I describe as one of the plucky set, where it's kind of a peripheral country to European affairs in general, but it has an extremely storied and interesting history, especially when you get to the Renaissance period and the exploration of Africa. The voyages of Vasco da Gama and the other explorers is incredible. The tales of them going around Africa, founding colonies, going to India, going to the Indies, going to America, of course, and founding what would become Brazil. I think Portugal's also been a country that punches above its weight, and that always interests me as well. I've also always had a fascination with Portuguese literature. I read the Lusiads of Camões, I think is how you pronounce it in Portuguese, when I was quite young, and I still read them quite regularly to this day. The collection of epic sonnets about Portuguese explorers written in the 1600s, I believe. And of course, the works of Fernando Pessoa, who I will mention a few times in this stream, who was a fairly obscure poet and essayist who lived from the kind of 1880s and died sometime in the late 30s, I think, and who wrote a quantity of very interesting, what I would describe as extremely existentialist literature, and is only really being translated fully into English now, because a lot of his material is being sort of sifted through and things like that. So yes. And of course, Portuguese literature of the 30s can't go without mentioning Salazar. And of course, Salazar in general is very interesting from a reactionary point of view, because he's a regime that does in some way attempt to construct an alternative to the ideologies of the 20th century, and kind of is kind of like Franco, an example of a kind of non-fascistic right-wing movement that had quite a lot of influence and power in its home country. I also know much about his counterpart, Getulio Vargas, down in Brazil, who was. I think you could argue that his regime has had more of a long-lasting impact than Salazar's did, but Salazar was much more personally successful at staying in power. So that's big.
Just on that note, just something, just in case I forget to bring it up later, regarding your idea that Portugal represents some form of contrasting state compared to other regimes of the 20th century. I'd like to frame it slightly differently. I'd like to think of it as a system before the Second World War, which lingers onwards, way beyond, you can say, its shelf life. So say, for example, you take the corporatist regimes in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. You can even say more conservative elements of Finland, and perhaps the most comparable, apart from talking about late Francoist Spain, which is the quote-unquote Austro-fascist, but really rather, you can say, clerico-Catholic dictatorship of Dollfuss and Schuschnigg in Austria before the Anschluss. I believe it's in many ways representing elements of this and the idea of incorporating Rerum Novarum and this depoliticization, how you can create a depoliticized regime, as sort of nonsensical as that sounds. And rather than all of these other regimes, which in the case of the Baltic states, they were annexed. In the case of Austria, they were annexed. In the case of Franco, Franco is the only sort of state which is enduring alongside of Portugal, which is interesting comparing the geography. But Portugal is one of these states which endures. But I think in terms of the special case of Portugal when compared to Spain is that it is also enduring in the colonial sense, not just in the domestic sense as well, which I think is remarkable when talking about the age of decolonization in the 1960s and 70s. So that's how I probably would prefer, from my point of view, to put it. But I also want to come back to this idea which you bring up about Portugal as one of the plucky nations, because to look at his history before the 15th century, it's just an offshoot of the various Crusader kingdoms that spawn out of the Reconquista. You have, I think it's the Kingdom of Leon, it becomes the County of Galicia or something, and in the 12th century, it eventually becomes the Kingdom of Portugal. And really, had it not been for this pluckiness, this desire for exploration and discovery in the 15th century, it could have simply been assimilated into Spain, like Navarre or like Granada or like Aragon, Catalonia, all of these other regions in Spain. Instead, of course, it has its own language, but it forges its own path. And it really begins in the 15th century because Portugal is the first global empire. It is the first European empire in the way that we sort of understand that term, with the British Empire, the French Empire, even like smaller empires with the Belgian Empire, etc., etc. And also, it is the longest living of all of these empires. So I have a date up here, 1415 from 1999. That begins with the conquest of Ceuta in North Africa, Morocco, on the other side of Gibraltar, and it ends with the transfer of Macau to China in 1999. So you can say that the Portuguese Empire, despite Portugal's sort of less than advantageous geographic position in terms of just resources, geography, and population, Portugal is the first empire, and Portugal is in many ways the last empire, and I mean that in more senses than one. So just talking about this pluckiness and the nature of the Portuguese Empire, you've already brought up the idea of exploring Africa. Well, it was one of the first empires to really begin the consolidation of outer Africa, as you can see, although this map is rather misleading in the sense that the expansion into Mozambique and Angola didn't really begin until the 19th century. But by the 16th century, as you mentioned with Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese are already in India, and they are also the vehicle of the Jesuit missionaries at the same time. So they're not just bringing Portuguese commerce to places as far afield as Malaysia. They establish a power base in Malacca, which is near Kuala Lumpur, which is the capital of Malaysia, near Singapore. They also bring with them the Catholic Church as well. They expand as far as Japan, establishing bases throughout the Sengoku Jidai, or the era of the country at war in the 16th century. And curiously enough, they don't expand west. And why is this? This is because I think it's in the year 1494, Pope Alexander VI creates a treaty which effectively divides the newly found world discovered by Columbus in 1492 between the Portuguese and the Spanish. The Spanish get the great bulk of the empire, but the Portuguese get that little tip of the South American continent, which would later become the colony of Brazil. So effectively, all of the east was bestowed to the Portuguese, and all of the west was bestowed to the Spanish. Portugal is also essential in terms of understanding the role of the transatlantic slave trade. It's one of the first powers to really interact with this idea of, you could say, the rebirth of the slave trade, because it began colonizing the Azores, it began colonizing Madeira, then expanding farther south into Cape Verde and the coast of Africa. So Portugal is the source of all of these things, but it's also the source of, you can say, this desire to Christianize and bring the gospel to every corner of the earth and establish a sort of a Christian res publica Christiana upon which the sun would never set. And the Spanish come in, and you can say their original conquests are far more localized. They're concentrated around Peru and the Mexico Valley. Later, of course, they come to eclipse Portugal in terms of that original size, and Spain will establish themselves in the Philippines. But in terms of the East, you can say over India in particular, Portugal remains the most influential economic European power in India up until the 18th century, when the British eclipsed them in that role. Is really, I would say, there are two major events which sort of destroy the Portuguese Empire in many ways, or not necessarily destroy it, but harness it and force it to become eclipsed by other empires. Have any of you heard of the fate of King Sebastian?
Yes.
Yes.
Do either of you want to talk about it?
Well, all I recall is he went to war in Morocco. I think it was a civil war between two princes, and I forget the name of the battle, but Sebastian and the two rival claimants to the throne all die at the same battle. And as a result, because he dies without any heirs, what happens is Philip of Spain, Philip II, is the closest living relative, because if I recall, Philip II's mother was a Portuguese princess. So through that link, he's actually the closest relative. So he invades and basically establishes a union with Portugal called the Iberian Union, which lasts for about 60 years until there's a restoration war and the House of Braganza become and take over independent Portugal.
Yes, just before Sebastian is replaced by, in Portuguese historiography, it's called the Philippine dynasty, because it's the reign of the three Philips, Philip II of Spain to the Philip IV of Spain. But there's this myth, essentially, that Sebastian wasn't really killed, and that he will heroically come one day to restore Portugal from this position of ignominy. Nevertheless, that doesn't happen. Instead, his nephew briefly takes control as the Cardinal King Henry, and when he dies, Philip of Spain comes in and conquers the country, but leads to this really rather surreal situation in which he has two empires which are nominally under his control, that of the Netherlands and that of Portugal. And yet the Netherlands is technically in revolt against him and begins setting off its own colonial empire. And who is the main power which suffers as a result of the expansion of the Dutch into the East Indies trade and into the spice trade? It is the Portuguese. So you have one kingdom of Philip attacking another kingdom of Philip. And ultimately, by the 17th century, the Dutch have replaced the Portuguese as the major sort of maritime power in the East. Nevertheless, I think it's important to understand that Portugal doesn't just sort of wither away. In Portugal itself, as you can see, with Brazil, they are expanding across the territory. There's even a brief attempt, I think, in the 17th century for the Dutch to try and establish their own colony in Brazil. It doesn't last, and by the late 17th century, the Portuguese are once more back in control of Brazil. They discover gold there in Minas Gerais and other places, whilst they're also expanding into Mozambique and Angola. So the Dutch are able to go through a short reprieve. And I would say the last time that the Portuguese really had, you can say, a golden age or a prosperous era was very long before we have the era of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. It was during the 18th century. One king to me stands out, which is King John V, who rules in the first half of the 18th century. He is able to assert Portuguese sovereignty and independence. He's one of the first kings of the House of Braganza, which takes over Portugal in rebellion against the Philippine dynasty, against the Spanish. And he's sort of wonderful in the sense that he sends all these great gifts and builds all these splendid carriages for his trips around Europe to try and demonstrate Portuguese prestige, pomp, and power. You have a special Josemite architecture spread throughout Lisbon, which is associated with this age. And then something terrible happens, which in 1755, shortly after he dies, there is the Lisbon earthquake. And it should be important to understand that this earthquake is so catastrophic that the modern discipline of seismology, or the study of earthquakes, comes from this event in 1755, because 50,000, as many as 50,000 people died in that earthquake. It's effectively an occasion of much greater magnitude. You could say national scarring than the Great Fire of London, which only killed 6 people. And as a result of it, the then king of Portugal, Joseph I, developed such a severe claustrophobia that he couldn't spend the rest of his life in a walled palace anymore. He had to move from tent to tent along with all of his court. But amidst the, you can say, the calamity and the destruction and the process to rebuild Lisbon and by extension Portugal after this natural disaster, we see the rise of one Marquis de Pombal. And the reason I bring up this figure is because he to me reminds me so much, almost uncanny elements of what we see later with Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, because he attempts to create a Portuguese absolutist state, a Portuguese autocracy, which not only challenges the aristocracy and tries to create elements of, mercantilism, strengthening the economic ties and the centralization of the colonies, which is what they'd already been doing in the French colonies and the Spanish colonies. But he was also trying to lean on this idea of the Estrangeirado, or the Portuguese equivalent of the French philosophers, and the idea that he was basically an enlightened despot ruling on the behalf of his king. And so he actually went after the church. And this may sound very confusing for people, but with the early 16th century, the Portuguese are the power which is bringing the Jesuit missionaries all across the world and expanding them as far afield as Japan. And in the 18th century, in 1759, Portugal would be the first power to really attack the institutional authority and the possessions, the wealth, and indeed the monopoly of education held by the Jesuits. And they begin the suppression of the Jesuits in 1759, confiscating their territory, suppressing them. And it leads to a cascade of events in which 14 years later, in 1773, the papacy will in fact disown the Jesuits, their most stalwart defenders. So just an indication of how influential and powerful Portugal is in the 18th century and what effect it'll have on the state of later Christendom. And I think you can say that am I right in saying that the regime of de Pombal is really the last sort of gasp of this great era of Portuguese history?
Certainly, because obviously when King Joseph dies, I think it's his daughter Maria comes in and she gets rid of de Pombal. She's known as Maria the Mad, I believe. She was quite insane, and then you've got that. You've then obviously got the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon invades Spain, Portugal. There's a lot of back and forth going on and devastation.
Yes, that's quite a lot of sort of history brought up there. I think just to focus, so we have a strong, almost Bismarckian style government under the Marquis de Pombal, under a weak and ineffective king. When the king dies, we have the early reign of Maria. And I think it's fair to say that Maria does have a long phase where she is sane, kind of like King George III, who reigned without incident from 1760 until 1788. With Maria, I think it's fair to say that she was in control of her faculties from around 1777 up until 1797. But as you say, then she is officially declared insane, and there is a regency established by John VI. John VI, who is a very weak, unassuming, uninteresting man with no hard political convictions one way or the other. Most of his political ideas come from his wife, and so most of the initiatives, political, from all the powers of Europe. Portugal is still so significant that there is an active French contingent in Portugal, and there is an active English contingent in Portugal. Again, bear in mind this idea of the ancient history of the English and Portuguese alliance. I think in terms of the exact date, I think it starts in 1386. Nevertheless, I really want to put to sort of end this idea of this amicable relationship. To me, the Anglo-Portuguese alliance is as convincing as the special relationship as between the United States and the United Kingdom, and has the same sort of.
situational.
Yes.
Yeah, I completely agree, AM. Yeah, that's something I've thought of for quite a while.
Although, in defense of that, somewhat, the Anglo-Portuguese alliance, I believe, is non-binding. So say if anybody declares war on Britain or on Portugal, the other power is not required to automatically join. They're only required to do so if specifically requested, as per the terms of the alliance. It's not automatic. So,
But just to emphasize again, when Britain gets involved in the Napoleonic Wars, so just to again briefly sum it up, Napoleon is expanding across Europe. He imposes this continental system to try and control trade coming to the continent, mainly targeting Britain. Spain is basically his ally and collaborates with him in targeting Portugal, which is the last sort of open port in the continent, and a joint Spanish and French invasion takes over Portugal. So when the British come and try and rescue elements of Portugal, it is again out of their sort of survival to establish a link, a trade conduit throughout the rest of the empire and try and undermine Napoleon's power. It isn't out of this noble idea of the Portuguese, the salvaging the Portuguese alliance. Rather, it is based in this overall logic of trying to defeat Napoleon. Of course, because Napoleon is a treacherous snake, what does he do? He turns on his Spanish allies, then precipitates a 5-year-long peninsular war involving hundreds of thousands of troops and a protracted guerrilla campaign against him, while Portugal itself is subject to repeated French invasions. There are 3 French invasions, and at the site of the first invasion, what do the royal family do? They leave Lisbon and they cross over the Atlantic and they do something remarkable, which is establish a government in Rio de Janeiro. The equivalent would be effectively if our royal family went off and established a new court in New York during the 18th century or the early 19th century and made New York the capital of the British Empire. That is what happens in Portugal, and it has a weird sort of lasting effect in terms of Portuguese history, both in terms of the nature of the Portuguese monarchy and the nature of the empire itself, while Portugal itself is basically under the command of the Duke of Wellington and by extension William Carr Beresford. So in terms of this alliance, again, it is very much the case that Portugal has been subjugated to Britain to service Britain in terms of its overall war aims in defeating Napoleon, which they do. They defeat Napoleon in 1814 and again in 1815, but the British never go. Instead, William Carr Beresford basically stays there as this Grand Viceroy or plenipotentiary, acting as the permanent sort of state secretary of the Portuguese for the Crown of England. And at this time, what is the Portuguese royal family doing? Napoleon's defeated. Would you want to leave the luscious new court of Rio de Janeiro, and also the fact that Brazil is far more populous and economically powerful than Portugal, and the fact that Portugal has been invaded 3 times, it has been devastated by war? No, there's very little desire of the Portuguese royal family to return back to Brazil. Not only do they happily rule from Brazil, but they elevate Brazil's position. No longer is Brazil a colony, but Brazil is a kingdom. It is now officially renamed the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. Just to focus on something, because this is a tangential point, which I'll come back to later. The Algarves is actually a pluricontinental kingdom within Portugal. It represents both the African portion of the empire, but also the southernmost province of the mainland of Portugal proper. That's just a tangent, but I'll get back to it. So we have a royal family in Portugal who are elevating the Brazilian state. At the same time, you have a rather angry and radicalized population who have been in proximity to these ideas coming out of the French Revolution. At the same time, there is a series of liberal revolutions and independence revolutions going on throughout Spanish South America. In 1812, you have a new liberal constitution, which is promulgated near Cadiz for the Spanish Empire. And when King Ferdinand of Spain returns, he is faced with this issue of, what do I do? Do I try and hold on to my throne and rule as my father did, Charles IV? or do I abide by this new constitutional regime built in the spirit of the French Revolution? Instead, he fights it and he ultimately wins over it. And Portugal, interestingly enough, is placed in a very similar situation. So you have this situation where the Portuguese are very fed up with the fact that their royal family is stuck in Brazil and elevating Brazil while demeaning Portugal and not focusing on Portugal at all. You have a long-lasting British administration basically ruling over Portugal as plenipotentiaries. And so in 1820 in Portugal, there was a military-led revolution supported by various Masonic lodges and secret societies, which deposes William Carr Beresford. And these group are called the Vintistas, so I'll keep coming back to them. And they establish a new constitutional monarchy based on this idea, which is coming out of Spain, the 1812 constitution. And also they abolish the Portuguese Inquisition. It should be noted that because Portugal is still, despite the reform and the expulsion of the Jesuits under de Pombal, Portugal is still a Catholic religious state. And what you can say with 1820 is this intensification of anti-clericalism, with the association that the leftist revolutionaries are going to be on the side of state atheism or secularization or ecumenism or whatever you want to call it, some iteration of sort of anti-integralism or anti-Catholicism, and that the right in Portugal are going to be supportive of the rights and the prerogatives of the Catholic Church. And it is into this toxic situation that finally the King of Portugal, John VI, now that his mad mother has finally died, is going to return to Portugal. So before I get on to the liberal wars, is there anything anyone wants to add to my rather brief summary of events there?
Well, relating to the sort of the British influence over Portugal, obviously it massively, drastically increased during the Napoleonic period. But what was also interesting is I think it had something that had been steadily increasing ever since the Portugal became an independent sort of monarchy again. Because I mean, how familiar are you with the Methuen Treaty, AM?
Would you like to explain it for us?
Well, what the Methuen Treaty was, it was a treaty signed in 1703 between England and Portugal. It was essentially done for trade purposes because Portugal was actually leaning towards, I believe, because around that time we got the Spanish War of Succession, Portugal was actually leaning towards France. So basically one of the reasons England signs this treaty is to try and pull Portugal back over to the Allied side, in which they do. So basically the purpose of it is a trade agreement. So England will export sort of cloth and other sort of textile goods to Portugal, while Portugal will import port wine to Britain. Both are at reduced duties. And the main reason Britain does this is on paper, it looks good for Portugal because the reduction of the duties that they're doing, so the British textiles are lower duty than the Portuguese wine, so therefore Portuguese are paying less for their goods respectively. However, it's actually not very good for Portugal because by having the duties on the textiles be so low, what happens is the Portuguese economy is flooded with cheap British textile cloth, which crashes Portugal's textile industry. Whereas, because Britain doesn't have a much viticulture, the elite just consume all the wine. So therefore, what ends up happening is Portugal becomes economically dependent on Britain, and Britain makes an absolute killing off of Portugal, essentially.
Absolutely.
The eternal Anglo strikes again.
So we establish here economic dependency, but we also establish the fact that Portugal will remain an agricultural power, and Britain will become an industrial power, effectively. And that is the relationship between the two. And that is something which will endure throughout the entirety of the 18th and the 19th centuries, apart from very limited attempts to create a tiny manufacturing base of Portugal and try to exploit its colonial empire. So into this situation, we come back finally to John VI returning to Lisbon. He leaves his son behind, his son and heir, Pedro, as regent of the Kingdom of Brazil. But the revolutionaries aren't happy about this at all. They've reclaimed their king, finally, almost like Louis XVI returning from his flight to Varennes. And now they want to reassert their control, not over just the king, Portugal, but the entire Portuguese empire, and especially Brazil. And they believe that having Pedro essentially acting as regent in the Kingdom of Brazil would mean that the royal house, the House of Bragança, has a permanent power base on which to direct future actions against the constitutionalists in an incredibly weak and impoverished state in Portugal. So rather than do that, they abolished the Cortes, the Parliament of Portugal, the new Constitutional Assembly. They abolish the regency in Brazil and try and force Pedro to return to Portugal under the guise of continuing his education. But of course, as the Cortes was the enemy of the Bragança dynasty, when Pedro refused this order to return to Portugal, he was rebelling less against his father, the king, than he was against this radical faction within the parliament. And so he does something rather interesting. He doesn't embrace the cause of his father. He doesn't embrace the cause of the Portuguese monarchy. He doesn't come back with the power of Portugal to try and reclaim and restore the monarchy to how it was before the Napoleonic invasions. Instead, he does something quite different. He collaborates with Masons and various liberals in Brazil to form a broad church local power base within Brazil. And in return, he receives the title from them as their patriarch, as the perpetual defender of Brazil. And thereafter, he leads the military operation to drive out individual Portuguese garrisons. And he would later accept, Pedro, the title of citizen emperor in imitation of Napoleon, who was originally the emperor of the French. So we see this remarkable situation that a colony is using one of the members of the royal family and the ideas of Napoleonic France to create a new form of independence movement, in contrast to the Bolivarian Simon Bolivar revolts throughout the rest of Latin America. To try and put this in perspective, it would be like Prince George, who would later become King George IV, being invited to become the Emperor of the United States. As ridiculous as that sounds, but that is what happened in Portugal, and that is what happened with the Empire of Brazil. But it doesn't end there, because this creates a cascade of new problems, because now we have an emperor of another country who is simultaneously the heir to the throne to Portugal, which is having its own protracted crisis. So while Brazil has achieved its de facto independence, which John will only recognize just before his death on his deathbed, all sort of intrigue is now revolving around the Queen, Queen Carlotta, because, as I mentioned before, John is rather an idiot, and so is very much under the influence of his conservative wife, who wants to completely reverse the influence of the French Revolution in Portugal. And she is aided by the youngest son of John and her, Miguel. And they carefully begin to lead various insurgencies against the constitutionalists. And by 1823, they have basically assumed shadow power back in Portugal and have control over the king. When the king finally dies, we have this unenviable crisis of a succession crisis between a liberal foreign ruler who had rebelled against Portugal and someone who was completely unamenable to the constitutional settlement or the liberal settlement in Portugal, which was the absolutist Miguel, who was very much his mother's son. So Pedro of Brazil, now Pedro IV of Portugal, tries to effect a compromise whereby he will organize a new liberal constitution and leave the throne to his 7-year-old daughter, Maria II, while forcing out his younger brother Miguel, forcing him into exile. This doesn't work. Pedro goes back to Brazil. Miguel comes back from Vienna to effect a counter-revolution. And this leads to another situation where Emperor Pedro abdicates in Brazil, comes back to Portugal with support of the UK and Spain. At this point, it should be noted that almost the exact same thing is happening in Spain, whereby you're having this succession crisis, which is dividing the royal family into liberal factions and absolutist factions. In Spain, King Ferdinand is basically convinced by his wife to make his daughter the heir to the throne, in breach of a Salic law introduced in Spain when the Bourbons come along. And as a result of that, we have a purist faction, a legitimist faction in Spain under Prince Charles, later becomes the Carlist movement. And we later have the cause of the infant Queen Isabella II. And something almost identical is happening in Portugal with the cause of Maria II, and by extension, King Pedro IV and the former Emperor of Brazil, and Dom Miguel, and the Miguelists basically filling in the faction for the Carlists as they were in Spain. By 1834, Dom Miguel has been defeated, Maria II is restored. With her father now dead, she doesn't have anyone to protect her. And so we see a Portugal from 1834 up until really the 20th century, which is subject to the whims of various strongmen, alternating coups and political factions, and this unique system where you have all of these liberal factions which are constantly alternating in terms of their political ideology. No real strong man or strong constitutional power structure behind that. And we see eventually the system of rotation of these centrist parties like the Regenerator parties or the historic parties and later the progressive parties, who exist basically with the acquiescence, the guidance, or the direct control of various military strongmen, like Marshal Saldinar, who becomes Prime Minister of Portugal various times throughout, I think, the 1840s, the 1850s, and finally in the 1870s. At this time, we see, you can say, not a reversal of the attacks on the Catholic Church that were used during the constitutional phase. Rather, these are intensified. Very much we see what we see in France with the Revolution, when Talleyrand declared that the monasteries, etc., were the biens nationaux, the goods of the nation. And so nationalization of various church land and trying to possess the lands and the property of the religious orders is used as an attempt to economically revive Portugal, sorry. But all of these things are muddled because there is no guiding influence, and because King Louis or Queen Maria II and later King Charles, up until right at the end of his reign, are relatively weak. And instead you have all of these competing and somewhat contradictory elements existing in Portugal at the same time. Portugal remains very poor. In terms of international affairs, she becomes completely overshadowed by rival powers. Spain, despite the loss of her colonies, almost completely overshadows Portugal. The only sort of notable thing really to consider is that Portugal finally establishes a civil code, or an attempt to synthesize all of their laws into one single code in 1867. And I think it's here where it'll be useful to really talk about the colonial situation with Portugal, because as we mentioned, Portugal was one of the great empires, and indeed it was the first and in many ways the last great global European empire. And even with the loss of Brazil to another branch of the House of Bragança in the early 19th century, Portugal still holds on to this rather expansive empire encompassing much of the African coastline, possessions in Goa, possessions in Konkan, in Western India, possessions in Timor, which is next to Indonesia, and of course Macau and other various islands such as Cape Verde, Madeira, and the Azores. So to compensate for the fact that Portugal her economy has cratered, she hasn't industrialized, she is overly economically dependent on Britain, Portugal tries to reclaim some lost prestige by creating a large presence in Africa. It should be noted that at the beginning of the 19th century, Portugal was probably the joint largest power in Africa. The only power that was comparable to it was Britain. And only Britain, because Britain had basically confiscated the colonial empire of the Dutch when they established Cape Colony. So other than Cape Colony, you only have these tiny little pockets. So, for example, you have Danish colonies in Africa, you have French colonies in Africa, you have British colonies such as the Gambia. But by and large, the largest sort of most enduring presence in Africa is that of the Portuguese. And the Portuguese have all of these historic claims going back for hundreds of years on vast swaths of African territory. And by the 1880s, we come to the scramble for Africa. Now, if you look at this map, I have on the right here the famous rose-colored map, or the New Brazil, to be founded in Africa. As you can see, Angola and Mozambique form the southern sort of sphere of Africa on both sides, on the Atlantic side and on the Indian Ocean facing into Madagascar. The idea then was to establish a new Brazil, or a new sort of large colony, kind of like what the Germans desired with Middle Africa, which is to link Mozambique and Angola as Portuguese colonies by way of the modern states of Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi. And by 1879 into 1882, they were making various inroads into these colonies. Then you finally get to the main event which demarcates all of these colonial boundaries, which is the Congress of Berlin in 1884 to 1885. And Portugal, unfortunately for them, are roundly snubbed during this, because Bismarck, who is officiating over this, is insistent that Portugal can actually demonstrate that it has control not simply claim over the territories it desires. And it cannot, nor does Portugal really have the infrastructure and the resources other than to leave the occasional excursion or mission into the African heartland. And indeed, excursions before have been prevented by the lack of the inoculation against malaria, etc. It's interesting also to note that you can say the contradiction coming out in the Congress of Berlin, that Portugal is snubbed, yet who is arguably the biggest winner of the scramble for Africa?
Belgium.
Yeah, Belgium. Not just Belgium, but King Leopold specifically, because he not only gets a colony, he gets a colony for him personally as the property of the crown, not the property of the Belgian state. So in the middle of Africa, you have this massive new state, this Frankenstein's monster of a border set out with a tiny little exit between the two areas of Portuguese Angola. And you have the massive Congo Free State, which will later become the Democratic Republic of Congo and at one point Zaire. So despite Belgium getting all of this territory in the center of Africa, Portugal virtually gets nothing other than the territories it had already established. But the Portuguese aren't going to be put off by this. They've been told that they need to establish formal claim over these territories in order to gain international recognition for them. And so immediately after the Congress, they begin to lay claim formally to this area of the rose-colored map you can see on the right. The British aren't happy with this. In particular, on the ground, you have Cecil Rhodes and the South African campaign. You have the Foreign Office mission of Henry Johnston. And the attempt here is basically to win over all of the tribes between this territory to adopt the protection of Britain rather than the protection of Portugal. Obviously, Britain was in a much better position to offer that protection and offer suzerainty to these various tribes than the Portuguese, who were completely outclassed from an economic and military point of view. And this ends up in 1889 with these little clashes between the Portuguese and the Johnston missions, and of course Cecil Rhodes probing and ultimately founding Rhodesia, that is now Zimbabwe. So this effectively has led to a border war between these two quote-unquote allies, because they're now fighting over the same space, or the area north of what was then Bechuanaland, so Rhodesia, north, well, rather south and North Rhodesia and Malawi. And this is where we have the Great Betrayal. In 1890, we have Salisbury's Ultimatum, which in many senses could be said to be a betrayal of the Treaty of Windsor, which inaugurates the alliance. It establishes a de facto British influence over Rhodesia and Malawi, prevents the Portuguese from expanding further. And this is the ultimate sort of national humiliation, because after Portugal's, you can say, defeated position throughout so much of the 19th century and her economic woes, regaining this small strip of territory to unite their colony into a large African power would be some way to galvanize the Portuguese population behind the dynasty and be seen as a compensation for all of these individual defeats. The only sort of consolation for the alliance is that the British prevent the Portuguese allying with the Boers in the Second Boer War. Apart from that, hello?
I just wanted to say, you started your monologue earlier with the line that you were going to cover two major events in the, I suppose, the history up to this point that would lead to Portugal as a modern nation. Two great sort of catastrophes. One was, of course, King Sebastian in Africa. Would the other one be this?
Yes, I think it's fair. I think it's fair to say this, because with Sebastian, we see the temporal loss of sovereignty, which prevents the continued growth and power of the Portuguese Empire. And when it comes back in a weaker iteration under the Bragança dynasty. What we see here is a temporary restoration of that power as a result of the loss of Brazil, and they are denied this. And arguably, you can say it's rather pathetic on the part of the British that they won't, say, for example, concede northern Rhodesia to their erstwhile allies, the Portuguese, to allow them to link these territories.
It is, and reading Portuguese letters of the time, you can't understate the scale of this. I mean, this is essentially the Lisbon earthquake foreign affairs. I mean, the outrage, the shame, the humiliation, the anger, the political upheaval this causes, and it's especially bad because the king, King Carlos, is unable to deflect any of the anger, and it all basically results in him personally looking appallingly weak in front of his nation, and even more so because I believe he had received some kind of assurance from some friends of his in Britain, some British official in some way, that Portugal would receive some aspect of this pink map, and of course they don't, and so the king is not only made to look weak, but he's made to look like a breaker of promises, in thrall to the British, and I think a lot of especially right wing Portuguese are expecting a military stand on the matter. And although we can look at it and go, well, what could Portugal have possibly done? A lot of them were ready to fight over this. They were ready to go to war with Britain in Africa over this. But they didn't, of course.
Well, the British almost provoked the same thing with the French over the border between Sudan and Chad, say, for example, when they're expanding into the Sahara. So the British were content, but it's worse here because the French under the Third Republic were not hostile to the British, but they were certainly not friendly until the early 20th century. Whereas Portugal had been a historic ally, but also it was in no way a real rival to Britain. It wasn't a threat. It was effectively a vassal. And all this did was reinforce the idea in the Portuguese, in the minds of individual Portuguese, that they were a vassal. And that's not a preferable situation to really create in terms of this national hatred towards your overall, towards the overlord. And it couldn't have helped the fact that the Portuguese had a possibility for revenge during the Boer War. And instead, they just were very sort of pusillanimous and stayed by their borders and accepted these vague British promises of suzerainty to protect their territories from, tribal incursions, etc. But had, you can say, the Portuguese been willing to exploit, a military position over this, you can argue that supporting the Boers and the Transvaal Republic and trying to use that as a bargaining chip to, say, for example, even gain Malawi would have been preferable. But as a result of it, the Portuguese gained nothing other than, rather sort of meaningless British sort of proposals about the protection of their territorial land. At the same time, the economy is doing absolutely terribly. Between 1890 and 1908, the last sort of effective years of the Monarchia de Carlos, the state is on the perpetual verge of bankruptcy. And again, we talk about this indebtedness, this economic system which prioritizes Britain into international trade and frustrates the growth of a independent Portuguese manufacturing base. After this rotation of liberal parties, I mean, the one thing you can say which was good about the rotation of all these rather inert liberal parties, the Regenitors, the Progressives, the Historics, is that they were all defenders of the constitutional monarchy. They were all born out of this era of the liberal wars, ushered in between Miguel and Pedro and Maria II. And so in many ways, Portugal retained that political system. But now we are facing a new threat, which is going to impinge on the idea of Portugal, the Portuguese monarchy, and Portuguese Catholicism, which is the Republican faction, which is really launched off the back of Portugal's economic decline and colonial humiliation. And the only sort of thing that the Portuguese government has going for it is the last strongman of the royals, which is Minister Franco, not the Franco everyone's thinking of. This is the Portuguese Franco.
Wow, Franco.
Yes, comes in and he begins to expel the Republicans from Parliament and briefly rules as Portugal's dictator for 1 year until the Lisbon Genocide. But before I talk about the Lisbon Genocide, I just want to talk about where the Republicans come from and what their ideology is. Yes, they're regicide. Portuguese republicanism was inspired by the example of the French Third Republic, which had been formed in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War. having started as a provisional government, by the 1880s, France's Republican government was secure under Jules Grévy and Prime Minister Léon Gambetta. They had rehabilitated the legacy of the French Revolution. They had introduced La Marseillaise as the national anthem, and they had even tried to rehabilitate elements of Jacobinism. Throughout the 1890s, the French government was cracking down on populists such as Boulanger, monarchists of all stripes, whether they've been Bonapartists, Orleanists, Legitimists, etc., and any Catholics associated with the French political right, because in France at this time, to be on the left was to be an atheist or a secularist, and to be on the right was to be a Catholic. And at the turn of the 20th century, the Republicans under Émile Combes affected a very aggressive form of secularization, or in France, laïcité, against the lingering political influence of the Catholic Church, which is the division, ostensibly the division of church and state, which sounds very sort of benign when you hear about it. But what this really means is that Catholics are purged from the institutions. They are not allowed to teach, offer religious instructions, and most religious property in France, such as monuments as Notre Dame, were nationalized. And even French Catholic officers in the army were purged by Émile Combes. So this was a wholesale desecration of the political right. And thereafter, France's political landscape was irrevocably changed. And it only came back in a much more muted form under the ideology of Action Française and the philosophy of Charles Maurras.
Yes.
Also elsewhere, sorry, yes. Go ahead.
Yes, I was just going to agree with that. The beginning of the 1900s for the French right is a disaster which they will never really recover from. Briefly, perhaps, under Vichy, but I don't think that really counts. Essentially, from that point on, there is no resurgence in the French right meaningfully.
Well, I'm going to bring up de Gaulle a little bit later, so I'll talk about that because it's the interesting parallels between Gaullism and Salazar, but I'll hold on to that for a moment. Mm-hmm. So this also should be noted that it's not just republicanism in Portugal. Brazil had a very popular king, Pedro II, and despite this, he is deposed in, I think it's 1889, by a military clique, ushering in the Republic of Brazil. So already in its Latin American counterpart, the House of Bragança has been deposed. And although Portugal has its own history of confrontation between the church and the state, we talked about de Pombal, we talked about the French revolutionary spirit, which was sort of whipping up the Portuguese sort of anti-absolutists in the 1820s, the Republican program was essentially imported from France. And fortuitously for the Republican movement, the Republicans' support swelled with Portugal's national humiliation at the hands of the British. The Republicans were exploiting the humiliation as a defeat for the monarchy, and were thus able to gain broad church support from Portuguese nationalists rather than simply from their core anti-clerical pro-French revolutionary agenda. So they were essentially forming a coalition of hate towards the monarchy rather than aspiration towards a new utopian republican society.
And it should be noted that while Franco was deeply unpopular with everybody for large amounts of his tenure as prime minister, for various reasons, he was one of those dictators. I suppose a good comparison would be Primo de Rivera over in Spain, who alienates both the left and the right and eventually loses all support. But one of the problems with Franco was that he enacted some... I'm trying to remember the specific details of it, but what he... I believe that the king's wealth, the king's personal wealth, begins to deplete. And Franco works out a deal by which the king will receive a much larger allowance from the Portuguese treasury. What this means is that although Franco becomes increasingly unpopular and the king wants to dismiss him to save the regime, he can't due to this financial agreement, because he is now financially dependent on Franco, essentially.
That's an interesting
very,
argument.
Very canny move from Franco, tying the king to his rule.
But I think it's also the fact that I'm going to argue slightly on Franco's side that there really was no alternative at this time, because just to justify it beyond, you can say the ulterior motives behind Carlos. The problem also with Franco for the Republicans is that Franco had by empowering Franco by making him de facto dictator of Portugal, he had ensured that the monarchy was interfering in areas which it hadn't really intervened for decades at this point. The monarchy had assumed direct responsibility for the government in the face of the Republican threat. And this also represented the failure of the system of rotation of these liberal constitutional parties to contain the Republican movement. And so the king, in proclaiming his prime minister Franco dictator, was basically an attempt to say that this is an interim government until normality could resume, new elections could produce a tolerable outcome, and not just a majority for monarchists, but a working government which can actually counteract this threat without having to rely on Franco. So you can say with the situation almost seems like a return to the 1820s, with the rotation parties feeling snubbed and with no sort of active support for the monarchy, no real support around a strong man. Instead, and of course, all the mainstream political parties now feeling that they have been disenfranchised. We have this call for direct action, and it's organized through secret societies, through the Masonic lodges, and we see the creation of the second Cabonaria, which is based off the Italian Cavonari, which was a post-French revolutionary association. This was formed when Miguel tried to begin his counter-revolution back in the 1820s, so rhymes constantly sort of going throughout Portuguese history. And their direct action results in political murder, assassination. So at first, there was an attempt at an assassination of Franco by a group, the so-called Group of 18, which failed. And this leads to a roundup of many prominent Republicans. They're not executed, but there are many of them. There are sort of 100 who are rounded up. And the final act of Carlos I in 1908 was to suspend habeas corpus to subversives and ordered their expulsion to the colonies. But before the act was proclaimed, 2 Republican assassins murdered the king and his heir, Prince Louis, in their carriage on the Terreiro do Paco in the center of Lisbon itself. So we see this murdering of the king and his heir in the front of his palace, right in the heart of Lisbon and the heart of their power. Franco is disgraced from this because he's seen as unable to protect the king. And out of the regicide, we have the unsuspecting Prince Manuel ascends to the throne amid a temporary air of public sympathy. Franco is disgraced from this fiasco, and despite this public sympathy, and despite, you can say, the courage of the 18-year-old King Manuel II, the Republicans are still determined to use direct action to effect change. If they're not going to murder all the members of the House of Braganza, they are simply going to take over the government.
Yes, according to Pessoa's writings from this time, the consensus among Republican... Well, so the first thing to note is that according to Pessoa, Republicanism was very... It was something that burned very hot, but it was largely relegated to Lisbon itself. And most of the provinces were politically much cooler. And indeed, the north, as we'll probably go on to cover, was actually deeply monarchist. That will come up later, importantly. And the consensus among many of the bourgeois Republican leaders was that, as kind of dishonorable as this open murder was, they considered it a what would the word be? A kind of par for the course of the way things were unfolding, and that it may be a necessary step to proclaiming the republic. There was, as he's mentioned, there was an initial outpouring of sympathy for the royal family, but the Republicans largely take this in their stride.
I think it's remarkable to consider that this is effectively what happened in Russia, except you condense 40 years and you make it 2 years, as was the case in Portugal.
Yeah.
And it's also the same people. With Russia, which is only about 30 years before this, with the assassination of Alexander II by the Narodная Volia, or the People's Will, we later see a new organization eventually comes in and will ultimately be responsible for murdering the royal family and taking power in 2 revolutions, not 1. But it's the same sort of group of people who are back organizing the takeover of power using the military. And it also should be stated that despite Manuel II's attempts to hold the government together, the removal of Franco has simply demonstrated the problem as to why he was made dictator in the first place, which is despite the fact that the Republicans have a very small amount of public support outside of Lisbon. In the election that was held in August of 1910, the sort of monarchist parties together won a overwhelming majority, but it didn't matter because there was no single faction or not a single dominant personality who could provide a parliamentary majority for which the king could govern. So there were 7 governments in the reign of Manuel II over 2 years, and so effectively you had the system where the political paralysis would continue. And also the Carbonari realized they would never gain power through democratic means or legal means. And they had already, because you mentioned the localized control of the Republicans, not only localized in the sense of their confinement to Lisbon, but also localized in the sense that they control various social strata. So they have a large amount of bourgeois cosmopolitan supporters, but they also have a lot of military supporters. And it is through the radicalized elements of the army that in late 1910, we have a coup d'etat, which represents a republic through pure military fiat. And rather than precipitate a civil war, the king simply slides away. He almost gets captured, but he manages to escape from Lisbon into exile in England, never to return. And shortly after, the Republicans banish the monarchy and members of the royal house. Also, I should be noted in terms of the indebtedness of the Portuguese revolutionaries and their imitation of France. Look at this bastardized iteration of Marianne we have here and celebrating the proclamation of the Republic and what was effectively a military coup d'etat. I mean, at least for the French, you can say that their political system happened as a result of the collapse of the empire and the failure of Patrice MacMahon to create the new the sort of new morality regime. Yeah. But here we have a bloody regicide followed by a swift coup d'etat, and it is on the back of blood that the Republicans have achieved power. And despite their very early fracturing, they are ruthless in their objective to remove the lingering support for monarchy, which they believe in their principal opponent, the Catholic Church. Yes. So they imitate themselves from France, they secularize cemeteries, they legalize divorce, they ban religious teaching in imitation of the separation of church and state in France, or laïcité. Again, Portugal has its own iteration, which is introduced in 1911. Jesuits have their citizenship forfeited. And again, it's similar how amazing the comparison is between France, because the French radicals, the revolutionaries, are all committed to anti-clericalism. But as with France, once that's defeated, once the left is in ascendancy, they begin to tear themselves apart. The Republicans fail to establish a political movement to unite the nation around, to improve its economic, let alone its international standing. And I think a demonstration of how you can say ill-conceived the Republic is when Portugal joins in on the First World War. It does so effectively at the prompting of Britain, realizing that Germany's attacks, the U-boat campaign, etc., and the colonial excursions between Germany and Britain in Africa are by proxy affecting Portugal. And so with British goading, Portugal basically leads the confiscation of German ships in its ports, which leads to the German declaration of war. But as a result, they're effectively nothing more than a sideshow in terms of being a vassal of Great Britain.
Just to add some more clarity to this issue of the Republic as well, the problem you have with the establishment of the Republic is this, that in general, people are either the majority are generally apathetic. There is lingering monarchist support, especially in the north, which will go into an armed rebellion. But generally, outside of Lisbon, there's this apathy. The reason that people acquiesce to the Republic is because they believe it's going to solve the inward rot of Portugal as a nation. They believe that it will lead to national regeneration. And generally, a lot of people became Republicans in the first place because they saw the monarchy as the symbol of all that was wrong with Portugal, and that simply by removing it, they would usher in a new era of prosperity and progress to Portugal. And obviously, this has the exact opposite effect, because the Republicans come to power slightly unexpectedly, and there isn't really any kind of program in force. There's no real center players. This isn't like what would be a good example, I suppose. This isn't like in Spain later, where you have a kind of coherent Republican leadership, or someone like Azaña, who is the kind of driving intellectual force. You have this kind of motley collection of bourgeois politicians, intellectuals, kind of middle-ranking military officers, and none of them can really agree on what exactly they want. They pursue this, as AM said, this radical program of attacks on the church, which to me just reeks of petty-mindedness more than anything, and a kind of victory glee, just because they can, really. And none of them can agree on what sort of, like, what is this republic going to be? Is it going to be a kind of sort of presidential monarchy? Is it going to be a kind of British parliamentary sort of thing? Is it going to be more to the right or more to the left? Or, what? There is no coherent vision for what this new state is going to be, and it immediately collapses into chaos and dysfunction, essentially.
It is sort of remarkable, but I do think a similar situation happens in France, where you have a long session of growing pains. France starts off on the Third Republic as strictly presidential, and it later evolves into a parliamentary government, and later that just completely collapses in the 1920s and 1930s. What we see in Portugal is this, again, like I mentioned with Russia, with the assassination of Alexander II and the deposition of the Romanovs in 1917 and 1918. With Portugal, all of these things seem to be sped up radically. I talk about this idea of these multiple governments in the last few years of Manuel II. Well, this is massively intensified. There are 8 head of states and 44 individual governments. And the reason I bring up Portugal's participation in World War I is because it goes hand in hand with this idea of resurgence, of striking Portugal out on its own and not being dependent on Great Britain. And that is where a huge amount of the public goodwill towards the new Republican government comes from. The idea that Portugal will be regenerated and restore its international standing, not only its economic situation, as a result of deposing the monarchy. Instead, it's subject to the same humiliation and the same degrading status as basically a puppet of Great Britain. Because as a result of the participation in the war, despite the tens of thousands of Portuguese who die, Portuguese even participate not just in the colonial sphere, but they participate on the trenches in the Western Front.
Yes,
in response,
2 infantry divisions, I believe.
In response to this, what does Portugal receive? Does Portugal, say, for example, receive German East Africa? No. Instead, it receives one port from German East Africa, Kionga, while the rest of German East Africa is made a mandate of the League of Nations, which, quote unquote, actually means a protectorate of Great Britain and later a colony.
Yeah.
So as with the 1890 humiliation, all this is just a repeat of that same humiliation again. And again, you can say almost just the demonstration of Portugal's, humiliation at this point. The British just use Portuguese possessions to keep Blessed Karl, Emperor Charles of Austria, as a prisoner, like Napoleon on St. Helena, except here it's Madeira. So it kind of like
dies of a tropical disease, wasn't it?
Absolutely. So where we see almost like Britain, Britain ceding the key bases to the Americans during the Second World War, and later on you can say there's that joke that Britain is nothing more than an American aircraft carrier in Europe. Well, effectively that is what Portugal is to Britain at this stage.
It should also be noted that although Portugal's contribution in the grand view of things, with its 2 divisions on the Western Front and some naval contributions, like even that, the Portuguese republic really can't afford it. They cannot afford to enter the First World War. I mean, there was a debate going on in Spain throughout the First World War about whether to join the war. And at first, like with most European nations, there's a general clamoring to get in on the action. The reason Spain doesn't join is, first of all, because the king and the government are, I believe, Germanophile, but among the population at large and among the more liberal and Republican elements, there is an Anglo and Francophilia. So there's no real consensus on what side Spain should join. And of course, there's the other issue that Spain they're well aware that the army isn't ready. They don't really have a sizable navy, and they can't afford it. The internal situation is such that Spain cannot enter the war with any reasonable hope of achieving anything. And Portugal basically has the same problem, but they decide to just go, well, to hell with it. Let's join.
In fairness again to Portugal, I believe that this was prompted, to the extreme by the British, and they effectively precipitated war with Germany, albeit they didn't formally declare it. Germany declared war on them. But in the situation, Spain, oddly, in a weird position, isn't as fundamental to this war effort because Portugal, with its colonies, I mean, I just show on the map, it's difficult to explain because I don't have a colonial map with the German possessions, but the German possessions actually surround the Portuguese colonies.
Yes.
We have East Africa, German East Africa, which is modern day Tanzania, north of Mozambique, and we have German Southwest Africa, modern day Namibia, which is south of Angola. So Portugal, and indeed by extension, keeping trade with Britain open and acting as another effort against the U-boat campaign. All of these things meant that Portuguese participation in the war from Britain's point of view was much more fundamental than Spain joining.
Well, wasn't there a whole fiasco during the war where the German forces completely occupy Mozambique, I believe?
Yes.
And then the Portuguese army occupies Tanzania, I think, or Southwest Africa.
Yes, so Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, who was the German sort of commander in Africa, he basically leads this guerrilla campaign. It's a shame Marcus isn't here because he knows a lot more about it than I do. But it's amazing. He holds off for so long against the British and the Portuguese that you're right. He does actually occupy parts of Mozambique for a time, yes. And he actually recruits native Africans from Portugal's own colonies into soldiers and vice versa. I think.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's what I'm saying. So in that conflict, both the British, Portuguese, but also the Germans are recruiting native Africans from their own other sides' respective colonies into their own forces, which causes problems after the war as well. And obviously, not only do they not get much, but obviously their own colonies are occupied and devastated as a result. So
yes, and I read one article on the war in East Africa, which argued that Portugal entering the war was actually enormously advantageous to von Lettow-Vorbeck because he now had a fresh base of operations to plunder, essentially, and to keep his campaign going without.
That's fascinating. And poor Germany. Portugal. I mean, the Italians talk about the mutilated victory. Well, just with Portugal, that's just taken to the next extreme, isn't it?
Quite sad. And it's actually even more so because there were some genuinely very, very noble and brave Portuguese officers throughout this period who many of them were loyal to the monarchy and were disillusioned with things once the Republic took power. And a lot of them actually went to Africa or served on the Western Front. And, it's quite nasty to think of these sort of honorable, sort of genuinely moral men being essentially screwed over by political blundering and British manipulation, I suppose. Being sent to Africa with basically no real chance of success.
Yes, it's no surprise really that the Portuguese have their own version of the fascist rebellion, albeit it's not done by fascists, it's done by monarchists.
Yes.
Shortly after the war, so in 1919, I believe it's one of the imperial ministers, i.e. one of the ministers of these colonies, who leads a monarchist uprising in the north to support Manuel II. Indeed, if he was a imperial minister, then it makes complete sense that the greatest source of antipathy from the Republic would come from the Portuguese colonial administration, given how poorly they've been treated. But this had been dubbed, the Taritania, or the monarchy of the North, centered on Porto. Again, it relies on this power base within the countryside. I mean, it should also be noted that Braganza, the actual sort of region where the royal dynasty comes from, is in the same region. But within a month, this had failed. There is a lack of coordinated leadership, and there is also an inability to inspire a revolution in Lisbon and in the south.
I'm of the opinion that the monarchist uprising could very easily have taken over the government. The problem was that Manuel II refused to give it his support, and refused to even talk with the monarchist leaders. So it immediately collapsed, because it's rather awkward to have a monarchist movement without a king.
There's a different. I can understand why Manuel's coming from in terms of trying to disavow his own supporters. I don't think it's that simple. If he were presented with a fait accompli, in the sense that order has already been restored, the coup has succeeded, if he were to take power, no more blood will be shed, then Manuel II would have no sort of guilty conscience in accepting a return to the crown, because he doesn't want a civil war. But simply becoming a partisan in a conflict which will result in civil war, if anything, him becoming a leader in a unconfirmed coup, in a coup which only results in victory over a certain part of the country, would, if anything, just reignite and help foment the conflict like we see in Spain in the 1930s. So I can understand why Manuel did that. As for Manuel himself, I mean, he remains in exile in England. He edits and forms this fascinating library of books of Portuguese history, and he's actually sort of credited as quite the able scholar when it comes to Portuguese history. But he dies without an heir, despite marrying. And after his death, even though he refuses to acknowledge them, it is the banished descendants of Dom Miguel back in between 1828 and 1834, the Miguelist side of the Portuguese family, who've been disowned by the mainline branch, who would assume the pretense as the Brigantine dynastic heads. Yes. So it's an interesting situation in Portugal, where, unlike in Spain, you had contesting figures with the Carlists and the deposed Alfonso XIII. In Portugal, effectively, the Alfonso XIII equivalent has died childless, and the sole recognizable heir in reality is the Carlist, in this case, the Miguelist.
Well, I was going to compare Manuel to Alfonso XIII, 13th in speech marks, because I know that you have qualms with that numbering.
I'm amazed you can remember.
That's nevertheless what he's known by. But although the monarchist political parties won a majority in the elections of 1931, Alfonso leaves the country because, like he doesn't want to be leading a civil war on behalf of a monarchist faction. So he acquiesces to the Republic by simply leaving the country.
Well, I mean, the Portuguese situation, to my mind, is far more sympathetic than the Spanish situation. In many ways, you can say that Alfonso XIII was almost premature in his desire to abandon the country, whereas in the case of Manuel II, he'd been forced onto the throne due to a regicide and the murder of his elder brother, and he was then forced out of power by another military coup. So in the case of Manuel II, he had no choice but to flee the country or start civil war. So. Whereas with Alfonso XIII, you can argue the power could stay on. If anything, it's sort of remarkable that it seems rather strange, doesn't it, that all of these things are reoccurring in Spain nearly sort of 20 years later, at a time where everything else is going in the opposite direction throughout Europe. It does seem rather bizarre that all of these things seem to happen. I mean, in the 1820s, these things were almost exactly concurrent. Mm-hmm. So you have the constitutional uprising, the supporters of the French constitutional, monarchy in both Portugal and in Spain. And then in the 1830s, you have the division of the House of Braganza and the division of the House of Bourbon into radical factions, the sort of radical absolutist factions, and then the tamer constitutional factions who are likely to be controlled by British influence, among other things, just
Well,
to put that out there.
in fairness to Alfonso, I mean, not to get too far off the main issue at hand here, but I think his decision to leave was also prompted by an immediate fear for his physical security. Because trying to think who it was. I believe it was General Sanjurjo told him that he could not guarantee the loyalty of any military units, essentially. That, at any given moment, any of them could be in on the Republican conspiracy. So
that's fair enough. I think what I'm trying to emphasize is ambiguity versus no option whatsoever, as we've done with the second.
Right.
So I think this is finally time to get to the coming of Salazar. So while
we're an hour in,
well, I think it was important to justify all of this context. It's very difficult to understand the Estado Novo without understanding, because all of this comes back later. So while leftists of, and again, I'm sorry to everyone listening, but I am a glutton for historical context. Again, you can go anywhere else. You can probably find a 3-minute history out there of the Estado Novo. Instead, you stay here.
That's not what we do here.
That's not what we do here.
This is not your pop history channel.
This is deep dives here only.
Yes.
So absolutely. So while leftists of all stripes, from communists to democratic socialists, remained generally committed to the cause of the Republic, despite the fact it failed to produce any capable governments, most centrists and rightists have become resigned to the fate of the Republic as incapable of restoring order. In many ways, these same people were ambivalent towards the fall of the monarchy, but now they're ambivalent towards the fall of the Republic. And the government, of course, as I mentioned before, have been under a permanent threat of bankruptcy since after the ultimatum in 1890. The currency was massively inflated, and the participation of Portugal in the First World War, as Panama has already mentioned, has only contributed to Portugal's dire financial situation. There was anarchy on the streets of Lisbon. There were constant terror plots. There were bomb threats. I think something like hundreds of bombs went off in Lisbon alone just during the decade, the latter part after the war and between 1926.
Again, according to Pessoa, this is what really evaporates all enthusiasm for the Republic, because everybody just wants peace and security now. Essentially, they'll take any option that will restore that. And the irony that Pessoa noted was that a lot of people had become apathetic towards the monarchy because it was unable to maintain order on the streets, and they assumed the Republic would, and it only got worse. So there's this kind of I don't know, what would the word be, this kind of resignation to the situation almost. It's just we don't really care about the Republic as an intellectual idea. We just want some kind of stability. Anybody that can do that job will be accepted, essentially.
And it's the same with Spain. I mean, most of the military officials, including Franco himself, the Generalissimo, are ambivalent towards the passing of the king and the end of the monarchy. Yes. Yet when it comes to 1936, they are interested in securing national order from the failure of parliamentary democracy.
Yes, that is the actual reason for the coup of 1936. Ostensibly, is to in the words of Miguel de Unamuno, the somewhat leftist intellectual who is enthusiastically in favor of the coup, despite his affiliations, is because he believes that it will solve the problems of the Republic. And it's only a short while into the uprising that Franco first unveils the monarchist flag at his headquarters in, I think it's Burgos, where he unveils the monarchist flag, and then slowly the other generals begin to submit to Franco's increasing dominance, and they go along with it, and they declare the monarchist flag to be their symbol, and then it becomes increasingly a restorative uprising or a reactionary uprising.
Well, but again, with Franco, I don't want to lean too much on this because it's tangential, but with Franco, it's a process of moving beyond a national movement under him, under a military dictator with him as head of state, no longer wanting any sort of participatory government, towards moving to this idea of him as the director, to him as, or Caudillo, the leader, to him as regent by right of God and the interim before the restoration of the monarchy. But this doesn't happen in Portugal. Instead, we have a similar situation where you have all of these generals who were ambivalent and didn't stand up, and indeed participated in the coup which deposed Manuel II. Oscar Carmona is one of these, you can see on the center. Nevertheless, he is implicated in 2 attempted military coups in 1925 alone. There were others, and indeed at all the subsequent military tribunals, Carmona in particular was acquitted. The military had no intention of persecuting their own for this, and of course this is just indicative that the army was no longer faithful to the Republic, and really was about finding a successful situation which could contrive a orderly state in Portugal. And in 1926 there was a new plot hatched under General da Costa. He's seen on the balcony on this image on the right after the proclamation of a successful coup. He was a very reluctant participant of this coup, and indeed he refused to acknowledge that it had been successful and was prepared to accept the surrender when receiving knowledge that it had actually succeeded. Nevertheless, the Republican government is successively deposed over the course of June. However, because da Costa had only been a reluctant participant in the coup, and he intimated this idea of some restoration of the republic or normalities of democracy, and so Oscar Carmona had no desire to return to that anytime soon, effected a coup within a coup, and by late summer of 1926, there had been a permanent military dictatorship established under Carmona. And really, this is the first stable government in Portugal, arguably since the dictatorship of Franco in 1908, and probably as stable as that time between 1906 and 1908. And we see attacks on it from all quarters, like that of Franco, so resisting various junior officers' coup, from those attempting to restore the Republic. Indeed, there was a large section of hostility to Carmona from the right because he was a member, he was a Freemason, and he was basically a tacit supporter of the Republic when it was founded. But again, we're talking about this idea of anarchy in the Republic, political violence, constant terrorism. And even though Carmona was really no longer satisfactory to anyone, he had achieved power and he was offering order. So regardless of your ideological stripes, there was a general ambivalence in Portugal, which was amenable to this idea of a pure military dictatorship, which Carmona was offering.
So it should be noted that the big problem of governments between Carmona and Salazar is money. They're as in there isn't any. There's at times the financial crisis, I believe, is so severe that they can't scrape together money to pay the government payrolls. You know, like as in ministers, civil servants, etc., aren't being paid. You know, it gets that bad. The colonies to which Portugal is now increasingly attached are swallowing up large amounts of money for administration. They're not turning a profit, as colonies tend not to do, actually. There's also, interestingly, I read one source which claimed that the government finances were made worse. There's recurring issues with the First World War because they have to pay the pensions of veterans, and a large number of people who weren't actually deployed to fight still get a pension because they signed up at the time anyway. And the damages done to the church under the Republic. I believe that the Republic copies something that was done in France and Mexico, where all church property is confiscated and priests are paid a salary by the state.
Yes.
And this paying of a salary to the church is also eating away considerably at government revenues. And that will be, I believe, one of the first things that Salazar reverses in order to stabilize the books.
Just on a note of Mexico, again, France is the first, Portugal is the second, and Mexico's revolution when deposing Diaz is in the 1917, I believe, and it only gets worse throughout the course of the 1920s, and there's a low-key sort of civil war in Mexico up until the 1930s.
La Cristiada.
but that's a different conversation altogether. But just a note on the
Should do a
political
stream
right.
on it someday.
Yeah.
Though. Very good.
Just a note on the political right coming out as a result of the demise of the Republic. So there was a broad section of, again, writers who were ambivalent towards Carmona, but he wasn't attached to any of the so-called right-wing political factions. In particular, there was a movement, the Lusitanian Integralists. Lusitania is just the Latin name for the original territory within the province of Iberia, and it was Hispania, and it was formed in 1914 in opposition to the avowed anti-clericalism of the Republicans. So it was specifically founded, like Shah Marat, in opposition to, like with France with Émile Combes, the Republicans had been inspired by France, and so the Integralists had also been inspired by France for this idea of Catholic political action, decentralization, the idea of national syndicalism, or wedding all of the classes together in some sort of unity of all the factors of society, which would later be exploited with Salazar and corporatism, and also a return to the monarchy. So in many cases, this imitated Action Française, and originally this had some tacit support, not active support, but tacit support during the monarchy of the North and Manuel II, and they began to drift ultimately to supporting the Miguelists. And when Manuel died, all of these factions went along and became Miguelist supporters and integralists. So where does Salazar come into this? Because Carmona comes into power and he doesn't leave power. He remains in power as head of state until his death. And Salazar comes in later. It's unlike Franco, who establishes power almost immediately after the failure of the original plot in Spain. Salazar is remarkable in the sense that you've already mentioned Panama, this idea of imminent bankruptcy, the too many people on the state's payroll, the fact that the entire sort of state apparatus is about to crumble. And Salazar was actually a member of the government on the eve of the coup, and then as finance minister, he then went away and refused several appointments as finance minister, not wanting to touch the government. So just a background on Salazar. Salazar was an academic and a professor of economics, and had he not entered into academia, he would have probably ended up as a priest. He first entered politics and entered into the Republican Parliament as a Christian Democrat.
Yes,
and
just on that, actually, I believe he did actually hold minor orders in the church. He got that far.
Yes, I think he was part of I can't remember what specific institution, but yes, he was on the precipice. Yeah.
I've got the name of it. The institution he was affiliated with was the CADC, or the Academic Centre for Christian Democracy. Despite their name, they were more interested in sort of Catholic corporatism than necessarily.
No, that's the political faction. I'm thinking about the religious order.
Oh, right. Sorry.
Anyway, I'll continue.
Probably find it, but yes. Anyway, he was nearly a priest, basically.
Yes, the emphasis though with Christian democracy was essentially an extension or trying to find the purest iteration of the political philosophy of the social justice of Leo XIII. You can say the first modern pope post the prison in the Vatican situation, which Pius IX really never accepted. Leo XIII, of course, is the author of Rerum Novarum, and he prioritizes this idea of Catholic social teaching or Catholic social justice above any return to the monarchy. And in that sense, he purely views the construction of the monarchy in purely academic and pragmatic grounds. Periodically, again, we talked about this idea that he had been a minister, he had been a member of the Republican Parliament, and he'd been in government in the last Republican phase, and he avoided any overtures by the dictatorship to regain the Ministry of Finance. And he only reluctantly agreed to be Minister of Finance in 1928, well into the Carmona government, when Carmona had failed to procure a loan from they had attempted to procure a loan from everyone. And when they failed to acquire a loan from the League of Nations, they begged Carmona essentially to come into the government and try and find some form of economic solution. I'll just very briefly summarize that he accepted control of the ministry, Salazar, with the guarantee that he be given full autonomy over all financial matters, over all spending, and a veto over all other government departments. Yeah. So despite his purview being the finance ministry, he was effectively in control of all government spending as well as the tax raising policies, etc. Again, this is an area which I'm not really familiar with, but it seems remarkable to me that within a year, he had seemingly stabilized elements of the economy and balanced parts of the budget. Do either of you have any sort of more depth to add in that regard as to Salazar as the financial whiz kid of the regime?
Yes. So it's not quite as miraculous as it sounds. The main thing he did was get an enormous loan from the Baring Bank in London. That was mainly because Portugal was on, like, quite, as I said before, quite literally on the verge of economic collapse. There was no money to go around. They needed an emergency loan, and a big problem prior to this is that, of course, what a government does when it's an emergency is it gets a loan. Portugal is unable to get loans because its government is so unstable, and there are prime ministers and presidents coming in and out at every opportunity. There's also a bit more Anglo trickery because a lot of British banks, I believe, have a kind of cartel-like attitude towards Portugal, where Portugal is written off as a lost hope for credit, so no credit is given. There's the Portuguese are unable to get any sort of help. It's like a sort of drowning man begging for a lifebelt kind of thing. And Salazar's main first success, I believe, is that he is able to get this loan from London. He under quite harsh conditions, though, I believe, and he then just goes about slashing. He cuts and cuts and cuts and cuts. He reorganizes things to make them more efficient in general. I believe he restructures the pay structure of the army. And again, he's doing things that are very much outside the remit of a minister of finance. Like I said, his restructuring of the army involves, I believe, cutting the size of various regiments, moving divisions and things around the map. It involves slashing the pay of certain high-ranking officers, and some are fired. This is all coming from the Ministry of Finance. This is ordinarily this would be the purview of the Minister of War or the Portuguese equivalent of the Home Secretary, but this is all coming from him. I believe within a year, the first budgetary surplus occurs in about sort of 30, 40 years, I believe.
I just to try and find an example to this, because to my mind, Carmona in appointing Salazar during this first year is similar to Louis XVI appointing Jacques Necker as his Controller General of Finances, in the sense that the Controller General of Finance, unlike a traditional Minister of Finance, has a general sort of purview in various other departments. And Jacques Necker was significant in terms of being allowed a remit above that of his social station, given the fact that he was a commoner. Yeah. That and the fact that Jacques Necker, based on his international standing as a banker, a Swiss banker, was basically able to raise the credit rating of the Kingdom of France by his association with it. So I feel in that sense, also Salazar being a distinguished professor of economics, I think in that sense it's probably best to look at a figure like Salazar originally enacting a Necker-esque regime, and again, like Necker, also issuing austerity measures and economies throughout the French government. So what happens now that Salazar has temporarily stabilized the Carmona government? He attempts to resign very quickly on. There is a pretext where another minister, Figueiredo, has tried to offer some sort of reprieve for the Catholics in the national dictatorship against the worst successors of the Republic. He fails to get this proposal through due to opposition from members of the more sort of left-wing members of the army, and Salazar uses this as a pretext to sympathy resign along with him. And in response to this, Carmona personally visits Salazar and basically begs him to head a technocratic administration of his government with extended powers. So it's remarkable that a military dictator who's only recently come in and stabilized the government, is prepared to accept that he himself isn't sufficient to control the economic situation, and so he's going to rely on a strong man relying on a strong man.
I mean, this is the classic Caesarist technique, isn't it? It's I'm going and I'll come back if you give me more power, essentially. The oldest trick in the book.
Well, yes, the worst example of that is Ivan the Terrible.
Yes.
Yes,
it should be noted that a big feature in a lot of the history around this, when you read about it, is that Salazar had fallen and broken his leg, and as such, he was stuck in the hospital. So you have this situation where, rather than the finance minister being summoned to the office of the powerful dictatorial president, the president has to go and see Salazar. And whenever a nominally higher office is being summoned to come and see a nominally lower office, things are afoot. It's always a visual symbol of the direction of power, is who's being summoned to who. Even if it was just because Salazar physically couldn't go, it's still a very powerful symbol.
No, I absolutely agree. And the posture between them and the entire order of etiquette between them is fundamentally important. And again, to try and find another example, it is almost like Wilhelm I and his desire to sort of allow Bismarck to consolidate all power within this new office of the Chancellery. So Salazar
will throw one of his tantrums if he doesn't.
Yes, and threaten to resign if he doesn't coerce the king into a particular posture. So Wilhelm I, though, is remarkable in the fact that he was a reigning king, whereas Carmona is a recently installed dictator. So interesting comparison, but nevertheless, it does seem remarkable that Carmona, of all figures, is the one to extend this virtue to Salazar.
We should also note that, as John, not real name in the chat, has pointed out, had Salazar resigned, that probably would have been it for Carmona.
Oh no, I agree with you in the same way. And this is why I believe the Wilhelm I comparison is all the more pertinent, because Wilhelm, without Bismarck, would have abdicated and given the throne to his son, the Crown Prince Friedrich. So I believe the situation is almost exactly analogous in terms of, even though Carmona was a Republican sympathizer and wasn't really a devout Catholic, he was a Freemason, as we said. He believed that in Salazar he had effectively found someone who could save his regime and could act as the anchor to it much better than he relying on anyone else.
Well, I mean, it's incredible how quickly Salazar goes from fairly obscure professor of economics at a regional university to essentially the most powerful man in the country. I mean, it's very quick. His economic miracle is in less than a year. And shortly after, the dictator is begging him to stay in the government, because if Salazar goes, they're all gone. I mean, that is a lightning rise to power in my book.
Yes, and he makes a nonsense of the office of prime minister.
Yes.
The office of prime minister is virtually held by these rotating military heads.
He stays as finance minister.
But he stays as finance minister. He is the source of strength within the government, and these prime ministers come and go. They have their individual tiffs with Salazar, and Salazar remains. So, having eclipsed the position of prime minister, he then formally adopts it. And during this position, it should also be noted that there are several sort of minor gains during the national government before we get to the Estado Novo. So the government restores to the church the right to proselytize in the colonies. It bans the Communist Party. But again, it should be noted that Salazar's rise was in no way guaranteed, because the military clique was so varied and so many of them were anti-clerical, anti-Catholic. And to mitigate all of this, for Carmona in particular, the overriding concern was always order. So Carmona grew dependent on Salazar as basically a representation of this order in terms of reorganizing the finances and being able to push the fringe military elements into some form of submission. But this also represented the growing influence of Catholic social teachings and this idea of a Portuguese national iteration of Catholicism into the government.
The conservative... Sorry, go on.
Yes, because it's quite remarkable, because the regime that comes about because of the 1926 coup, the national dictatorship under Carmona, of essentially being a sort of a military regime, it's quite remarkable how they just sort of give way to this sort of civilian economist essentially. And I know there was a lot of resentment within the army and the military at this, but there was sort of nothing they could do because of how effective Salazar had been and the fact he had the full support of Carmona.
Well, yes, this is the thing, and Salazar was remarkably unpopular. Isn't really the word. He wasn't loved by any faction other than conservative Catholics, but all the other factions recognized how vital he was. I mean, who else could have turned the economy around like that? Who else?
Well, I mean, he wasn't even supported by many conservative Catholics either. Again, it really
were. No, sorry, go on.
But again, you're right in the sense that it really does seem submission to the great man rather than reliant on any particular ideology.
De facto power.
And so Salazar's government effectively is a consequence of his competence rather than any ideology, any constituency, or any political platform. He doesn't have an ideology. He doesn't have a political platform. He doesn't have a party. He doesn't have a constituency. He again, he's a technocrat being installed into a ministry to perform a part, and his power is entirely reliant on Carmona, who himself is apolitical, who is focused on restoring order. And so by extension, Salazar is just the extreme iteration, you can say, of this depoliticization of politics and this desire to go beyond parliamentarianism, liberal factionalism, all these sort of elements associating with national disintegration and chaos and disorder. They are solely concerned with this idea of order, and now an ideology has to be attached to it. But what is the ideology going to be? Well, Salazar is finally appointed as prime minister in 1932. And Salazar, of course, despite this depoliticized nature of him, the fact he doesn't come from a political party, as you mentioned, Panama, he does appeal principally to a mainstream, almost like Catholic moderate right, almost like the Catholic center right, who are prepared or ambivalent towards parliamentary democracy because proven so decisively in Portugal to have failed miserably. So when we come to organizations like, Italian style fascists, or hardline republic, kind of like a Church of England situation, we see both hardline Catholics and hardline Protestants being ostracized and removed from power. And again, in terms of this middle course in Portuguese affairs, supported by this new authoritarian government based on the power of a president installed by a coup, Salazar, of course, was ambivalent towards the monarchy. And despite receiving briefly Manuel II's support just before his death, Salazar, rather than deciding to restore the monarchy after his death and giving Miguel power, is loyal to Carmona and instead opts for these symbolic displays of national unity. So after the king's death, the body is allowed to return, and he officiates over the state funeral of the exiled king. Again, it's sort of like when Louis Philippe brought back the body of Napoleon. Again, it's a symbolic gesture towards this idea of national unity, but in terms of its political significance, it sort of goes no further than that.
He also makes quite clever use of Portugal's geographic extent to exile undesirables to an island off the coast of Guinea.
Yes, Cape Verde.
Cape Verde, yes.
Yes, I have the actual sort of part. I'll come back to it later when my notes finally get to there. But yes, absolutely. But again, it's not particularly brutal. Yes, it's not particularly brutal in the sense that the Portuguese execute their political enemies, as we saw with the last gasps of the Franco regime in Portugal. Political exile, sending your enemies effectively to the Portuguese equivalent of Australia, or in French, Guyana was the equivalent, rather than opting towards execution. So Carmona remains as head of state, basically officiating over like this Wilhelm I of Prussia-esque situation, and the Miguelists, who now represent the Brigantine House, are not restored. The Lusitanian integralist movement, which I brought up earlier as the ideological descendant from the French Action Française, is superseded by a new national syndicalist movement, which has got their own parliamentary force, the Camisas Azuis, or the Blue Shirts. And again, there is a tentative connection to the Spanish Falange under Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera, albeit they were actually in conflict. And despite their Catholic profession, the movement grew increasingly frustrated with Salazar. And of course, their number were eventually repressed and the organization was shut down.
Yes.
And indeed, Salazar referred to them as national communists, so emphasizing his disdain for any movement nominally to the right of him, or any sort of adoption of things he characterized as fascistic or representing some sort of crossing of the border between the Spanish Falange into Portugal.
Yes,
he despised all these popular paramilitary organizations which operate outside of his direct purview.
Yes, he has a deep distaste for what he considered rabble. So any kind of political organization that adopted mass tactics or tried to recruit kind of masses to its banner was antithetical to him. He couldn't say. He had a very what you could sum up as a medieval conception of politics. So what I would call an authentically reactionary conception of politics. This idea that you eschew ideology and work solely through a hierarchical societal system rather than this kind of party idea.
Yes, of course, but this is taking place in the idea of the post-revolution. So this isn't relying on the rejuvenation or the restoration of the old aristocracy or the rejuvenation of a new aristocracy. This isn't involved in, you can say, the restoration of church authority either. I've characterized this as a pluricontinental autocracy, and I do believe in my mind that the corporatist elements are tagged on, and in essence, this regime is more Bismarckian than it represents, say, to return, say, for example, to the era of pre-French Revolutionary politics or even pre-Enlightenment politics, where, again, the state, the person of the king represented the state, etc. And again, just in terms of like the intellectual essence of Salazar, so we talked about Rerum Novarum. In 1931, Pope Pius XI publishes Quadragesimo Anno, and we talk about this idea of corporatism, a system which can be described as corporatist, which emphasizes the unity of the classes and social harmony. And social harmony and unity prevailing always over individualism, unbridled capitalism, profit. And again, in terms of trying to come up with a scenario, I link back to my earlier idea that Portugal seems to be closer in tune to Austria of the 1930s, to the Baltic states in the 1930s and 1920s as well, and even perhaps with Horthy's regency government in Hungary at this time. So it is far removed from, you can say, the radical National Socialism of Germany, let alone the more moderate iteration of fascism under Mussolini. And again, this is a rejection, explicit rejection of both capitalism and socialism. So like fascism, it represents some form of third way. And this government is called the Estado Novo, the new state. And in this new state, which I believe actually is a fundamentally anti-reactionary title, political, but of course it's to represent a antithesis of the Republic. It's not necessarily restoring the monarchy, but it's not of the Republic. It's rejecting all of the ideas that came out of the Republican system of government, and in that sense, it is the Estado Novo.
I have to. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I think it's important to realize what a chance Portugal has here for this kind of experimental new state, because essentially by the 30s Portugal is not really tied to any legacy. It's not got the monarchy. The Republic has been discredited, so Salazar is essentially free to essentially do whatever he wants. He can create whatever he sees fit, purely in the interests of power and stability. He is not beholden to any institution. Really.
And ironically, both the monarchists and the Republicans have paved the way for him in this regard.
Yeah,
so
they discredited each other.
So the liberal wars destroyed the executive absolutist monarchy. The Republican system then destroyed the system of rotation of liberal parties, and it also destroyed the Catholic Church as a major viable political actor within Portugal. And at the same time, no right-wing faction or left-wing faction, whether it be the communists or the Marat-style integralists, were able to realize a political vision or platform which was able to unite a large swath of the Portuguese population. So into this, we have an incidental sort of military government which is focused on restoring order, and into this, Salazar provides the extent to which he can provide a vision and the competence to ensure some form of enduring regime that can provide order, not in the immediate term, but in the long term. And in terms of his conception of order, so we talk about this idea of a third way, rejecting capitalism, socialism, as Panama is intimating, returning to this idea of rejecting the sort of founded idea of the political sphere or political parties, and instead the Estado Novo has no political parties. It has no political factionism. For every version of parliamentarianism and every form of political party had failed Portugal through all of these various iterations that we've been going through. So the people of Portugal were reorganized into corporations where they would always be directed towards the national rather than the sectional or the individual interests. And rather than create a political party, as with the National Socialists or the Italian fascists, Salazar's National Union was concerned with the depoliticization of Portugal. So we have a party which was an anti-party. And the corporate nature of the government is reflected in the very constitution and even the wording, the nomenclature of the constitution, where we have a corporative chamber with groups from the Catholic Church, workers' syndicates, which of course were to replace unions, which could potentially be subverted by leftist political action and become part of the subversion of the national character of the state. So everywhere we're talking about, again, kind of like a modern realization of the medieval state conceived of through the Estates General. You can say, for example, Panama, if we're trying to realize this as some sort of new reactionary version in which all the estates of the realm are conceived in tandem together to augment and not frustrate the power of the state, which is represented in the monarch, which in this case is delegated to Salazar.
On paper, sorry, go on.
Sorry, just want to go back to your point, AM, about the idea that there's not really much legacy for them to go on, because obviously the monarchy's gone, the republic's gone. Well, the only thing there is a legacy of is the colonial legacy. They've still got the colonies in Africa and the legacy of all those who sort of ventured out before them. So, and I think we see that in the regime. You called it the pluricontinental dictatorship. They very heavily lean into that. And that's why they double down on it and don't want to give it up, essentially.
If it's possible, I just want to go over the domestic stuff just before I get to that, because that's going to be the end of this conversation, and I want to lean into that as much as possible. But yes, sure. I absolutely agree with you, and that is one element which has survived against all the odds, and despite Portugal's many humiliations, there is still a core of an empire which is still moderately respectable, even compared to Spain's, which had mainly been lost in 1898. So going back to my point, the only sort of real sort of power within the system, which kind of acts in terms of a normal political sort of semi-presidential function, is the office of the president. The president is to be popularly elected, and he was also effectively an executive monarch with sweeping powers to dissolve and appoint governments. And of course, he was even given a 7-year term limit. Now, we talk about this idea of, well, I really want to emphasize this idea of the indebtedness of the Portuguese revolutionaries and the Portuguese right to France. Well, here, Salazar is innovating, and I believe it is here that Portugal actually reverberates back onto France, because I believe that the Constitution of 1933 was actually the core inspiration for de Gaulle in terms of his structure of the Fifth Republic and the creation of the office of the presidency, which he was to possess. Even the idea of devigism and the idea of a new corporate nature, a national nature of France, and transcending the political factionism of the Third and the Fourth Republics. I actually believe that de Gaulle's main inspiration, ironically enough, was Salazar. So we talk about
as well.
Yes. So just talk about the idea of Portugal being a receptor for these various ideas. Now it is an innovator in terms of this. So despite the office of the presidency, which I believe inspired the Fifth Republic in France, Salazar held de facto power. He held real power. And as we mentioned, Salazar was indispensable. Salazar ensured the continuity of the national dictatorship and ensured its transition from the national dictatorship into the Estado Novo. But because, of course, it was an authoritarian government and was focused on eliminating the extremes from all ends of the political spectrum, whether it be the right or the left, we have the PVDE, or the secret police. Nevertheless, and of course, that's often, as with the secret police in Iran in the 1970s, is often associated with exaggerated political crimes. But the fact of this regime, the Estado Novo, is that because it is founded as an incorporation of these corporatist elements and based off Catholic social teaching, it is able to adapt and change based on international circumstances and based on the domestic circumstances in Portugal, enough so that it survives for 40 years. And when it falls, it's almost an incidental fall. And I would argue there's a bit of a conspiracy, which I would like to go into right at the end. So we have the National Union as the anti-party party, with no official ideology other than guiding principles of the nation, which is to be Catholic social justice. And these are supposed to transcend politics. And there is a quote I have here from Salazar in 1939. "We are opposed to all forms of internationalism, communism, socialism, syndicalism, that being workers' possession of and control over the means of production, and everything that may divide or minimize or break up the family. We are against class warfare, irreligion, and disloyalty to one's country, against serfdom, a materialistic conception of life and might over right." So everything is directed towards harmony, international harmony, and a rejection of all ideology or isms, which are meant to divide and create sectarian cults within Portugal. And by extension, it seems only natural that Salazar supports Franco during the Spanish Civil War. If anything, the Spanish Civil War further cements the control of Salazar because it exposes sympathizers with the Republic within Portugal, the lingering elements of this leftist military Republican clique. Because during the war, there is a sizable mutiny in Lisbon in the Navy. Salazar orders that the ships be destroyed, and as an extension of this, the civil service must swear loyalty oaths and formally repudiate all attachment to communism. And this is, I finally got to it in my notes, Panama. It is Tarrafal in Cape Verde, where the internment camp was.
Right. Tarrafal prison.
So at the conclusion of the Spanish Civil War, Franco finally gains an ally of a similar sort of political ilk, the main sort of ally, the ally he most needs within the Iberian Peninsula. And of course, this aids in the pursuit of neutrality during World War II. And this is where I really do believe that Salazar is significant, in the sense that he's finally asserting a alternative foreign policy compared to being nothing more than the vassal of Great Britain in extolling neutrality during the Second World War. Because it was very possible that a weaker government would have been pressured, coerced, or manipulated through a series of false flags to enter in the war on the side of England. And again, that may have even precipitated Spanish entry into the war on the side of the Axis and represented some sort of national calamity or tragedy for Portugal.
That would have been a truly horrendous thing to have happened.
Yes, but it's possible.
One side and Portugal on the other. That would have been. I mean, I can't even fathom a war on the land border between Portugal and Spain at this point.
Yes, but as with Churchill and his obsession with finding the soft underbelly of the crocodile, it's possible, and it's horrifying if you contemplate it.
Although one of the criticisms leveled at the Republic was that Spain in the periods of instability would conduct large-scale military maneuvers on the Portuguese border in the Spanish province of Extremadura, because around that region there are border.
Yes, that's a contested region.
Between, yes, Spain and Portugal.
A village, I think.
And it was since most of the army was deployed in Africa, it was worried that essentially Spain could just walk in and take it if they wanted to. And this was a huge criticism leveled at the regime by the right early on during the days of instability.
Well, the more radical elements of the Falange side of the national movement under Franco wanted a unification of Iberia as a way to offset Spain's, colonial travesties, and by extension, the incorporation of Portugal would also mean the incorporation of the Portuguese Empire. So, luckily, these things didn't happen to Portugal, and for the moment, it served both powers to be neutral and prevent joining with either the Allies and the Axis. Indeed, Portugal was a trading partner to both through the British, through the normal maritime routes, and using Switzerland as conduit to trade with the Axis. Of course, Portugal has an abundance of natural resources in its colonies in Angola and Mozambique. Tungsten and, of course, oil will later be discovered in Angola. So in this sense, Salazar was able to exploit both sides for his benefit. And again, he didn't have ideological sympathy to either side. To the extent that he had any sympathies, he believed that Germany was necessary as a bulwark to communism, but he despised National Socialism as much as he despised British-style sort of democracy as well. So there was no reason to join in both sides. Nevertheless, as a result of not joining on the side of the Axis, the bulwark against communism has lost, and now the Americans have arrived, and the Americans are representing a democratic onslaught, so to speak, throughout most of Europe. Mm-hmm. And of course, there was an original hostility towards both Franco and, to a lesser extent, Salazar, as because of course Franco had the most disdain because he was formally associated with the Nazis during the Spanish Civil War. Mm-hmm. But obviously, Salazar didn't have those same connotations. Nevertheless, he was associated with this idea of reactionary Europe, which is being, restored and given democracy. Germany becoming the German Federal Republic, West Germany, etc. Italy having, transition from fascism, having been defeated in the Italian Civil War and become nominally a democracy in 1948, etc. So within this new situation, yes.
Sorry, no, go.
Well, when we're talking about the Second World War, though Salazar and Portugal don't officially join the war, later on they do sort of lean a little bit towards the Allies because they do allow them to use the Azores and Madeira as naval bases.
Yes, absolutely.
And also Salazar does cut off trade ties with Germany later in the war as well, and stops exporting.
Well, there are two things I really want to emphasize here. In the same way that Ireland was officially neutral during the Second World War, albeit Ireland supported tentatively and volunteered, large numbers to actually support in the Allied war effort. I believe, why didn't Portugal enter the war in 1944 or 1945? Because Turkey did, and even Brazil should be mentioned. De Vargas entered the war on the side of the Allies, effectively to pick on the corpse as if they were vultures, effectively to try and gain something out of the war. But why does? Sorry.
To be fair to Brazil, there was a particularly vicious German campaign against Brazilian shipping during the war that prompted the Brazilian entry, because prior to that, Vargas had been erring on the side of the Axis powers, not the Allies, I believe. Although there was also a heavy hand from Churchill and FDR, because Brazil had significant strategic importance to the Allies. And also, I would like to note that although Salazar, as we said, didn't really get involved in the war per se, Portugal took in an extraordinary number of Jewish refugees from Europe. And there was I can't remember his name, but he was the Portuguese diplomat to Hungary who formed a ring of basically a kind of evacuation ring where thousands upon thousands of Jews were sent to Portugal. And I think they settled in the south and on Madeira and in the Azores as well, generally. And then most of those, I think, went off to Israel when that got going after the war.
I just want to finish my point, if that's possible.
Sorry.
I completely agree, and I cement the point that Portugal leaned towards the Allies. The official designation, like Italy during 1939 and 40, was non-belligerent. To me, the fact that Portugal was able to endure the entirety of the Second World War and not enter on either side was a test finally of Portuguese independence and sovereignty. As with Ireland, effectively Eamon de Valera believed that had Ireland secured and endured throughout the entire war without being forced by Britain, Ireland had effectively become a nation in its own right. And I believe this was a fundamental test in terms of the final sort of breaking away of the shackles of being a British vassal. And I believe this is incredibly important in terms of asserting a new way in Brazilian foreign affairs to understand Salazar's colonial policy going forward.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And another thing I wanted to say when we're talking about foreign affairs, during this time, sort of the South Spanish Civil War leading up to the Second World War, though we've mentioned Salazar previously held the finance ministry and later was prime minister, from about 36 to 44, he also holds the Ministry of War and the Foreign Ministry as well. So he's juggling all these different positions to, I think mainly it's just to make sure he keeps absolutely tight control over everything, because he can't afford to make a false step, essentially.
I do believe he does make a false step during this time, which I talked about briefly with you before we went on, but I'll talk about it now.
Mm-hmm.
So Salazar survives World War II, and in 1951, Carmona finally dies, having been president of Portugal for 25 years. Now, Salazar did not use the death of the Republican head of state to restore the monarchy under then Dom Duarte Nuno, the Miguelist, despite a law of the previous year that would have allowed the king to return to Portugal, rescinding both prohibitions against royals and Miguelists, which had been enforced since the Liberal Wars. He didn't return to Portugal ultimately until 1952. Franco, as you mentioned, Panama, meanwhile had recast himself in the role of the regent of the Kingdom of Spain, moving away from this idea of the Caudillo or the national director or the generalissimo, and instead adopting a strictly monarchical constitution, Franco regent by the grace of God. Instead, in Portugal, Carmona was replaced by Crivella Lopes, who was then forced to resign by Salazar in 1958 in favor of Emelico Tomas, who had the indignity of having to face off against an opponent, Humberto Delgado, in a hotly contested popular election that plausibly could have almost been won by Delgado had it been a fair contest. And again, we're using democratic principles to apply to a regime which is supposed to be non-political, therefore making a complete nonsense out of the 1933 political constitution. And as a result of this vulnerability, he was forced into altering the constitution to ensure that Tomas would be re-elected through the National Union, i.e. through the legislature, which was ostensibly non-political, but in reality controlled by Salazar. So the question is, therefore, given that it seemed to backfire on him almost immediately after, why didn't he follow the lead of Franco and restore the monarchy in 1951, given that the Miguelists were directly associated with anti-constitutionalism, anti-democracy, and with Portuguese absolutism?
As we mentioned before, with the comparison with the Marquis de Pombal, I wonder if Salazar basically saw a restoration of the monarchy as a threat to his own authority, because it would essentially be a rival to power who could just dismiss him if they wanted to. And I think he cared more. I think he sort of was so confident in his own competence and ability to govern, as he had done, that he had thought, I'd rather just trust myself than anyone else, really.
Panama?
I'm just of the opinion that he didn't see any reason to modify the regime in such a way. I think that it was probably something that was deeply considered, but I think the Estado Novo by that point was very much set in this kind of, I guess you'd call it a classically Republican idea of what it was. Again, as I said at the beginning of the stream, I feel like people like these regimes that come to power basically on the back of restoring order to a disordered regime are loath to make any move that may lead to a decline in order once again, because they know that that's what brought the end of the regimes that preceded them.
and I think possibly suddenly moving towards a monarchical restoration, especially given how thoroughly discredited the Portuguese monarchy had become by the time.
Yes, but this isn't the Portuguese monarchy. This is a new branch, which is why I emphasize this idea. But also, it's a new branch which isn't associated with the rapid decline of the Portuguese monarchy in the last element of the 19th century.
But I mean, how pronounced is that distinction to the population in general? I mean, surely to most people, it's just the monarchy.
I mean, if you talked about the Jacobite distinction versus the Hanoverian distinction,
but again,
I think you'll find that it's a completely different temperament.
Yes, but I still think the point stands that I think Salazar just, it's sort of like how the enemy of a good plan is the dream of a perfect plan. I think he was just entrenched in his way enough by that point to go against the idea of a monarchical restoration.
Well, regardless of any dynasty, it just so happened to be the Miguelist dynasty, which, Franco had a choice in Spain of which candidate to select, whereas in Portugal it was far less ambiguous.
But my next point was going to be, well, who personally would be the successor? Because, well, and perhaps Salazar judged that the candidate who would take the throne simply wasn't up to the job of ruling Portugal on the technocratic level that would be required to keep the Estado Novo going.
Yes, but he misjudged when he appointed Lopez as president, effectively. And the reason I bring this up is that we're talking about depoliticization and reactionary. Like I said, the Braganza family, I mean, regardless of what you think of them, they were the tribal patriarchs of the Portuguese dynasty after the death of Sebastian and the Cardinal King Henry. So in doing this, he had an attempt to really cement his regime as depolitical, as representing national conservatism or the restoration of Portugal as a nation. Indeed, in appointing a brigantine, he had the chance also of potentially laying also a claim of Brazilian prestige and power on Brazil as well, by virtue of the empire, because the Brigantine House wasn't simply a Portuguese house, it was an international house with international prestige. So I believe that he had a chance here to really emphasize and entrench the idea of the Estado Novo by making it both new and old, a restoration and a revolution, and by emphasizing the depolitical nature by appointing a divinely appointed head as opposed to a politically appointed head from below. And by extension, therefore, the appointment of the president had to be contrived in such a way not to allow any sort of democratic effort to be extolled in terms of appointing him. And he failed in that. He failed in that with the 1958 election, and he had to modify the constitution to compensate for that failure. And as a result of that, the office of the presidency was nothing more than a rubber stamp, basically a costume, a mannequin set up with epaulets and a sash and various medals, there to rubber stamp everything that Salazar did.
This doesn't magically go away by restoring the monarchy, does it?
No, I don't believe it does.
Still have the same problems.
I don't believe it does, but I believe the reason that Salazar came to this decision was an overarching concern for his personal power, rather than any true desire to represent a depolitical or post-political regime as the restoration of the monarchy would. And indeed, Franco acknowledged. I mean, with Franco, it's slightly more difficult because Franco had came to power as a result of a coalition between various monarchist factions. And so in deciding to restore the monarchy and the regency, and yet not appointing the king, basically like Elizabeth I, he was able to hold, or Bismarck was able to hold all political forces in contention, allowing the monarchist factions to vie with Franco over which candidate it would be, yet at the same time he held supreme power as the regent. So for Salazar, you can say that personal political motivation didn't exist, yet at the expense, I believe, that his ideology suffered as a result of his own political ambition. But I think that's really all I can say. And I just want to get to the economic side of things and the church side of things, because this, if anything, reinforces my point. throughout the 1930s and 40s, Salazar had maintained a system of import substitution or limited autarky. And by the 1950s, Portugal was finally stable enough, and as a result of the end of the war, to attract economic investment, resulting in basically a Portuguese equivalent of the Spanish miracle, whereby from 1950s up until after Franco's death, during Caetano's government, Portugal had an average GDP growth of nearly 6%. And this was during the case of the Cold War. He slowly abandoned autarky or economic nationalism. He joined the European Free Trade Association, the OECD, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. And gradually we see an increase of both exports and imports, so a reversal of this idea of economic autarky. And despite this, Salazar was unable to reverse the economic devastation, the decline that had occurred over the previous 200 years. And as a result of this, by the time of his removal, Portuguese GDP was only half that of the members of the average mean of the European Economic Community, or the EEC, before becoming the European Union. Yes, that's judging it by the standards of Western Europe, but Salazar effectively had only been able to just about keep Portugal alive in terms of its relationship with other European powers, and attempted then to imitate them and ingratiate himself with them, and as a result economically liberalize his regime, and you can say abandon elements of the national conservative portfolio that we would put across in the earlier stage before the Second World War. And this, I think, is reinforced also in his attitude towards Catholicism and the Catholic opposition that brought him to power, the Catholic opposition to the Republic, because Salazar only moderated the policies of the Republic, and he left their fundamental character and the idea of the separation of church and state, or laïcité, intact, despite his Catholic overtures. Catholic property that was nationalized by the Republic was never restored. Clergymen were obliged to be conscripted into the army under the guise of pastoral care. Catholic education remained voluntary, not a fundamental pillar of state instruction. I mean, even fascist Italy, as a result of the Lateran Treaty, had elements of Catholic instruction, Catholic education. Private education, of course, under Catholic institutions, even then that was state supervised for fear of being subversive. Divorce remained legal, civil marriages remained legal, oaths of loyalty were made to the state and by virtue to Salazar, and not to any sort of higher authority or ideology or the church. So he emphasized the idea that, like a de Pompa, he was a modern day autocrat who was allowing the effects of secularization so in far that they reinforced the power of the state, and by extension Salazar, as it was the case with Joseph I. Always the consideration is power, and by extension his own power. I mean, in terms of the overtures made to the church, they're quite pathetic. I mean, like the 1940 Concordat, which finally normalized relationships with the Vatican, and Pius XI and Pius XII were virtually cheerleaders of Salazar, believing he would give them more concessions. But in the end, his government was more akin to French Gallicanism, whereby the government officiated over the Vatican's appointments of various bishops. And the worst thing is that with Vatican II, Portugal almost went through an identity crisis because with the Catholic right, who had always opposed Salazar and been marginalized, the national syndicalists and the integralists, the Shah Morars, etc., had been ostracized from power on the right. And now, as a result of the Second Vatican Council, the idea of a depoliticized nation, or his conception of Rerum Novarum and social teachings, was being criticized as undemocratic, and his economic measures were seen as not doing enough to ameliorate the condition in Portugal.
Yes, it's quite, I mean, you can't understate the damage that Vatican II does to right-wing Catholic movements all over the world, because the church has unfortunately stepped into modernity far ahead of them, in ways they don't agree with but find hard to challenge because it's the church. So,
well, this is perfectly summarized, I think, in the contrast between Pius XII and his unequivocal support for Salazar, and Paul VI's mincing, nervous, almost embarrassment as a result of having been associated with the National Union and the Estado Novo.
Yes, There's also issues where various liberal priests and clergy begin to agitate against the Estado Novo and call for a return to some kind of liberal democracy, which partly informs Salazar's growing distance from the church and his regime. I do think I agree with you that the primary consideration is power, but that is also a factor to consider anyway.
Well, he's not responsible for Vatican II. I'm not making
it turns the church into something rather awkward for him, that it wasn't quite in a way that it wasn't prior to that, I think, is the problem. It has a similar, though I think less decisive effect on the Franco regime as well.
Well, the difference is that, I mean, Franco relied directly on Opus Dei to act as his technocrats, the infamous Catholic secret society. Yeah. Whereas in the case of Salazar, there was no such alliance with any particular institution or sect within the Catholic Church. Indeed, there was no emphasis in terms of describing the government as national Catholic either, in the sense that the regime was Catholic and everyone in Portugal was expected to be Catholic, because, like I said, the division between separation of church and state and laicite was never reversed in Portugal. But by extension, you mentioned the Jewish refugees, Panama. There was no sort of prescription against Judaism, Protestantism, or any sort of ecumenism within Portugal. Again, the concern was harmony, and the concern, I mean, if anything, it sort of reminds, if we're trying to find reactionary examples of this, I mean, it reminds me of a more medieval conception of toleration. That the idea that these things are nominally tolerated, it's almost like a state grant of a declaration of indulgence, in which case the state takes the role of a neutral arbiter over religious affairs rather than acting as its enforcer. So it's fascinating, but I would say that in essence, Salazar was an autocrat, a statist who prioritized order, national harmony over religious intrusion in temporal affairs. And again, in this sense, he is not too dissimilar to the seemingly radical Marquis de Pombal, who initiated the cascade which resulted in the banishment and the abolition of the Jesuits in 1773.
Well, another point I just want to add is because it's been with the whole him sort of not really restoring the rights of the church as much as we would have liked. It's also interesting because around this time in the early 20th century in Portugal, you two are probably aware of this, but I read about there was this event in I think it's Fatima in 1917 where there's a Marian vision, and there's a lot of there's a greater revival of Catholicism in Portugal, and you'd thought that Salazar could have taken advantage of this to constitute Portugal as a Catholic nation, because if you go right back, it was founded during the Reconquista as this sort of Catholic sort of crusading kingdom. So the fact he doesn't do that just seems.
Well, what I really want to talk about now, Hitman, is this idea that he was aware of all of these ideas. He was aware of this idea of Catholic rejuvenation, and he was aware of the idea of Portugal as a Reconquista nation, but he lent on these ideas, as we're going to talk about. He lent on Lusotropicalism because it politically was expedient for him at the time. So Salazar had briefly served, and this is sort of culmination of his national sort of vision for Portugal, his colonial policy, but also you mentioned the pluckiness earlier, Panama, the idea of Portugal as a nation of discoverers, of people who go beyond, again, to use the Spanish motto, plus ultra, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Yes. Well, this is sort of perfectly summarized in the Monument of the Discoveries. Sorry, I got the date wrong. I've done 1690 instead of 1960. Horribly apologize, to be awfully confusing. But as you can see, yes, as you can see with the inauguration, there were, the Portuguese Navy was in full display. So again, it was a demonstration of Portuguese glorious past, but also the temporal power of the Portuguese state as it was then, and also the ambitions that Salazar had before. And this is reflected in the colonial area, which we haven't talked about other than the situation of the Portuguese colonial empire. But as for Salazar, he briefly served as a colonial minister under the Republic, and there had advocated for the centralization of colonial administration and the need for an assimilation of the colonies into Portugal. So what we see, again, try to come up with a vague comparison with France, albeit it's very pertinent. towards the end of the life of the Fourth Republic of France in the 1940s and 50s, states of the African Empire of France, in particular Algiers, were incorporated into the French Fourth Republic. So by extension, we're seeing an attempt to divide Portugal not by colonial demarcators, but simply that everywhere is a province of Portugal proper, that Mozambique, that Goa, that Angola, that Cape Verde, that Timor, etc., Macau, are simply provinces of a pluricontinental, multiracial Portuguese kingdom. So how does one recognize that? Well, in the wake of the Second World War, the Portuguese colonial empire, and again, the fact that Portugal had remained neutral during that, showed that Portugal was still relevant on the world stage. And also, it should be mentioned that Portugal is different from Spain in the sense that, unlike with Franco Spain, Portugal still had a considerable colonial empire with, I'll go back to the map here. As you can see, a significant portion of Africa and smaller colonies all throughout the world. Indeed, the last sort of great colonies in India. Whereas at this time, Spain had Spanish Guinea, Western Sahara, and the Protectorate in Morocco, which as a result of a joint agreement with the French was actually given up in the 1950s. So by the 1960s, the Spanish Empire was effectively dead apart from a few bits of desert on the African coast, whereas the Portuguese Empire was still pretty sizable and was also consisting of all of these natural resources, which helped again make Portugal relevant on the world stage. So thus making the colonies of Portugal more Portuguese would arguably strengthen Portugal's international position as well as her internal position. There had already been indigenous statutes to incentivize assimilation of the natives. It gave natives the ability to effectively acquire Portuguese citizenship, though the number who had actually gained citizenship in this way by the time of the 1960s and the colonial wars was virtually minuscule. As it existed, the colonies operated on a de facto system of corvée labor, where natives would exchange work in terms of Portuguese masters in lieu of money taxation. And as a result of this, there was very much a segregated feel. There wasn't this sort of happy clappy idea that we're all part of this wonderful multicultural nation. We should definitely get away from that view. But I want to talk about the transition which Portugal undergoes as a result of the colonial wars. So to justify the continuation of the Portuguese Empire, Salazar tentatively adopts a theory called Luso-tropicalism, which was adopted by Gilberto Frei, you can see on the right. He wasn't the sole advocate of it, but this idea comes as a result of his work of, I believe it's Masters and Slaves, which was written in the 1930s to account for Brazilian sort of the sort of race relations between Brazilian blacks and Brazilian whites, etc. And the idea is based on the idea of a particular nature of Portuguese imperialism as a positive force vis-a-vis Northern European colonizers, because Portuguese culture was said to be ecumenical in the sense that it assimilated other cultures rather than separating them. The conquered state would essentially be a multiracial extension of Portugal itself. And by this extension, he believed that a key to Portugal's success was the comparative rates of miscegenation between the Portuguese Empire and other empires, especially when we're looking at the example of Brazil. So if we're going to sort of, and again, this is also responsible as a result of latitude as well. So the idea that Portugal is closer to Africa. And indeed, if we look at the Kingdom of the Algarves, Portugal is pluricontinental in the sense that it exists within Europe, but it also exists within Africa and has existed within Africa since the 15th century, the early 15th century. And so we have a half a millennia tradition of this existence of Portugal being closer to the tropics than any other European power. And in Brazil, a former Portuguese population, it should be noted, this was even described as representing a form of racial democracy, whereby large numbers of African slaves were in relative harmony again with the former slave owners. However, this is complicated because we bring up the idea, Hetman, of the Reconquista. Previous defenses of the Portuguese Empire had rested on this idea of the never-ending Reconquista, effectively, we start off with the reclamation of Iberia, then it crosses over into the former Roman province of Mauritania, Morocco, and it keeps going, conquering more lands in the name of the Catholic Church, and effectively affecting a counter-reconquista, or a continuation of the Reconquista, rather, emphasizing Portugal's fundamental Catholic mission, which was carried, as we saw in the 16th century, as far as Japan. As such, the pro-miscegenation theory, which again it was resisted by Franco until the 1950s, why did it suddenly gain preeminence? And I believe it was only to buttress the notion that Portugal had since the 15th century been a pluricontinental nation, essentially a counterbalance to African Black nationalism in a world increasingly hostile to Christianity. So it was a useful defense in the eyes of, international sort of a more leftist academic scholarship and proponents, socialist proponents of decolonization, etc., that Portugal had a handy theory to try and explain that its form of colonialism was far more amenable than other iterations of colonialism, and that it was actually addressed within racial terms as opposed to Christian terms. If anything, again, this represents Salazar's pragmatism in the sense that he was trying to present the Portuguese Empire simultaneously as a Catholic extension of Portugal, and yet at the same time trying to defend it on racial grounds in response to the claims of Black nationalists. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I 100% agree.
Yes, I'd have to agree too. I think so.
Right. You've just said to me, Panama, you'll have to go soon. So I'll let you go. I'll try and get through this as quickly as possible. But
it's a shame because I would love to have a more extended discussion of the colonial war, especially as it related to Rhodesia and South Africa at the time as well. Because it's a fascinating thing, but I think it really is a separate topic to.
Well, no, I do intend to talk about it here because it's fundamental to Salazar. So I hope you can stay as long as possible, if that's all right.
I don't have to go at a fixed time, but I do have to be up decently early in the morning, so I don't want to overstay.
All right, I want to talk again more on the broader strategic picture as opposed to the nitty-gritty of the actual war, if that's possible. So. Again, for Salazar, we have the church as a practical consideration for power. We're talking about the prestige of the Portuguese Empire, its access to resources, and again, this always for Salazar, the actual temporal state of Portugal itself and the empire and its relevance on the international scene seems far more relevant than these purely ideological concerns. Whether he sincerely believed in Luso-tropicalism, I really much doubt it. I simply believe it was a handy textbook to throw at people who are criticizing it from a Black nationalist point of view. So again, there was also the concern of the Cold War. If the colonies were to fail and they were to become independent, then there was the very realistic possibility that they would fall to communism post-independence. Thus, Portuguese pluricontinentalism, wedding this idea of the perpetual reconquista and Luso-tropicalism, was a key ingredient for Portugal and by extension the collective West in the campaign against the Soviet Union, albeit it was a campaign which was portrayed repeatedly by the United States, who I will controversially say that the United States always prioritized decolonization over anti-communism.
Yeah, I agree.
So on to Panama's favorite topic, defying the winds of change. So we have the Suez Crisis in 1956, we have the Algerian War in 1958, and finally de Gaulle pulls out of Algeria. The Dutch attempt to regain their East Indian Empire after the Japanese conquest and fail. The French attempt to regain control over Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos and fail. The British retreat from India and Pakistan and Burma in 1947. All round, the great empires are retreating, and America and the Soviet Union are beginning to carve out a bilateral world. Against this, Portugal follows a different course. In 1960, Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, delivers a speech in Cape Town talking about the winds of change, ushering in a new period of basically admitting that the colonies are too expensive to run and we're going to abandon them as quickly as possible.
That was a major international incident, by the way. That's often not remembered.
Yes, it precipitated in my view, it precipitated the Republic of South Africa.
Yes, it did. That was the main reason for it. I mean, the Winds of Change speech. it was protocol in Commonwealth nations for the Prime Minister and the King or any kind of visiting dignitary to exchange copies of speeches at least 24 hours prior to doing so. And despite requests and despite receiving a copy of Dr. Verwoerd's speech, Macmillan, for obvious reasons, I think, did not submit a copy of his. So he went up and gave the Winds of Change speech to a rather shocked and I think betrayed feeling South African audience.
Yes, it was seen as a direct charge against white minority rule in South Africa.
Yes.
And the extension, therefore, was that any continuing links with the British Empire for South Africa would mean the progression towards one man, one vote, i.e. black majority rule.
Yes.
And so very quickly, they abandoned the Queen as the head of state and adopted a Republican government so they could, again, like Portugal, achieve full sovereignty from Britain. So weirdly, Portugal and South Africa are undergoing a similar transformation at the same time.
Rhodesia too.
Yes,
And Rhodesia too, which becomes independent in 1965. And again, this is an unofficial. This is a unilateral. It's a unilateral declaration of independence under Ian Smith and the white minority out there to try and present a fait accompli to Britain, rather than having this policy again of black majority rule implemented immediately.
Although ironically, the Rhodesians, I believe I think they named the Queen as head of state, despite the fact that
Ian
Smith not recognized them.
Ian Smith directly appealed to Queen Elizabeth II as Queen of Rhodesia, and she formally rejected it. Yeah.
So there was this weird situation where they continue all the customs and traditions of a Commonwealth realm, including the national anthem being "God Save the Queen," despite the fact that this doesn't exist. There is no monarch of Rhodesia, because we're all aware of the situation.
So how does this relate to Portugal? So there have been attempts in various previous governments to give subsidies for Portuguese to settle out in the colonies, and by the end of the Portuguese Empire, there were roughly 350,000 ethnic Portuguese within Mozambique and Angola. To put this in perspective, that's actually relatively small. I mean, if we look at Algeria and the Pied Noir, there were roughly about 3 million Frenchmen living in Algeria. So in terms of the success of Portuguese colonization, it is very small in number, and the administration that did exist out there, especially the military administration, was segregated. So we have whites, the assimilados are the people who had gained Portuguese citizenship, but as we mentioned before, they were very small in number, and then the indigenato. And in terms of them representing a contingent of the Portuguese Empire, and in terms of transforming this idea of Lusotropicalism and multiracial Portugal from a fantasy into reality, in 1961, before the colonial wars, indigenous people made up 18% of the Portuguese armed forces. By 1974, they made up 50%. And this is despite the fact that during the last years of Salazar's government, Portugal had obligatory military service of 4 years, and this included 2-year tours in Africa. And rather than actually seriously bolstering the numbers, this actually facilitated massive emigration from Portugal, which, given the fact that 6,500 people, Portuguese, died in the colonial wars, was understandable, because there was quite a high mortality rate if you were to serve out as a counterinsurgent in Angola, Guinea-Bissau, or Mozambique. So and again, it didn't also help the economy. So despite the military draft, despite massive government spending, which effectively went from nothing to ballooning to almost 40% of state expenditure by 1974, everyone is being conscripted. The Portuguese males are going out into Africa, and therefore they're becoming more associated with the pluricontinental conception of Portugal as including Africa. Yet at the same time, indigenous Africans are also being conscripted into the Portuguese army, and they're given fast track eventually to promotion. And this involves various forms of technical education. So where does the insurgency come from? Well, one of the key organizations is the MPLA, various leftist organizations which later become communist-backed in some form. And this really begins in Angola. When violence begins in Angola, there is basically a demand by the United States government to Portugal. The government is then under JFK. And JFK basically gives an ultimatum, similar almost to the Salisbury Ultimatum in 1890, which is to abandon control of the colonies, again emphasizing the fact that the Americans prioritized decolonization over anti-communism, despite the avowed anti-communist stance of Salazar and despite the political nadir that would plunge Mozambique and Angola after the Portuguese left, indeed as a result of leftist and communist wars. So after this, there is an attempt at a color revolution in Portugal, the Abrelado coup, which has covert United States backing. And when this color revolution fails, all it does is steel the resolve of Salazar to continue this independent course for the retaining of the colonies of Portugal. And this, despite almost universal international opposition, international opposition from Britain, its quote unquote ally, opposition from the United States, and opposition from the Soviet Union, but also opposition from India. India, of course, had become independent in 1947, and there were various existing colonies, such as Pondicherry from the French. And in 1954, Portugal began to return some of its colonies in India to India. But in 1961, refusing to hand over Goa, which was the largest remaining colony in India, not just Goa, but Konkan and various areas along the west coast. Instead, the Indians simply took them by force, annexing the territories, conquering them, resulting in the deaths of, I think, a couple of dozen Portuguese and Indians at the same time.
Well, it should be noted that the orders from Lisbon, from Salazar, were fight to the death, fight to the last man, don't give up an inch of ground unless you have to. And the commander in Goa essentially said no and surrendered the colony to the oncoming Indian army. It's so odd to think of, because not a lot of people know about this incident, where essentially, you can make all kinds of arguments about it being a colony of Europe and Asia or whatever, but essentially India invaded Portugal. I mean, that's what happened. Like the Indian army invaded Portugal.
Yes, and consider that there was a direct attempt to directly assimilate these policies into the Portuguese nation rather than simply the Portuguese Empire. So yes.
And it also is questionable because you have to ask all kinds of things about Indian nationhood in general. I mean, the Portuguese had been in Goa since at least the 1500s, I believe.
Goa was, I believe, the first European colony established within, and of course, this is the legacy of the adventures of Vasco da Gama, and of course, it does. I mean, India wasn't just aggressive towards the Portuguese. I mean, India also annexed the princely states, most notably Hyderabad, and would later the next year be involved in a border conflict with Mao's China. So now, and of course, we have the whole lingering issue over partition. I still have yet to do that, but yes, India was incredibly nationalistic and believed that this was a restoration of territory, despite there having not been a united India sort of territory over the subcontinent to justify that. And indeed, it was a declaration of war, but it was played down. And instead, for the Indian point of view, it was basically, I can't remember if it was named like Operation Victory or something like that.
Operation Vijay was the name of it.
Operation Victory.
I read a paper some years ago about it, and the opinion of the student that wrote it was that essentially India got away with it because the rest of the world didn't care. I mean, for all intents and purposes, it was an unprovoked act of aggression. It was against a neutral country,
against a sovereign state that was nominally allied with the United Kingdom and associated with the West. And of course, India was not a member of the Eastern Bloc, but it was a member of the non-aligned movement again. So a very complicated political picture regarding the annexation. But it was a direct, unprovoked act of hostility.
And of course, I don't know if this would have been a major consideration at the time, obviously, but I would make the argument that Portuguese control of Goa as an entity is probably more legitimate overall when you consider everything than the Indian nation state as it was cobbled together post 1945.
Well, that's a radical point to make. I mean, it'll be interesting to pursue that further. But there's a more interesting question which arises from this, which again, you talk about the idea that Salazar was prepared to defend the enclave of Goa and the other enclaves in Portuguese India to the death. Compare the avowed stance of the defense of the territory of the Portuguese Empire or the Portuguese nation as a pluricontinental nation, and compare that with the way that Britain so willingly accepted the loss of her empire and her subjugation with the United States. At the time where Britain is almost actively participating in her own irrelevance in world affairs, Portugal is actively standing against international currents from all quarters, both west, east, and non-aligned, and is trying to strike out as an independent power. In contrast to this, Britain can't be attributed to anything other than a weak, cowardly power, a pusillanimous state, which is accepting its irrevocable state of decline and ultimately death.
Would it be too ambitious to take a slightly longer perspective view of this and say that at the beginning of the 1900s, Britain is a country with great wealth, great prestige, great power, great territory, but is fundamentally losing its way and undergoing some severe political crises. And then it essentially blunders through 2 world wars and comes out on the other end of it no wiser. Whereas Portugal is a country that has no wealth, little prestige, and basically no international power at the start of the 1900s, but which undergoes a transformation through the fire of chaos into a country bent, or at least has a government bent on self-regeneration and bringing Portugal forwards into a new and decisive vision of itself, which Britain completely lacks. So even though Portugal is a far less powerful state in pretty much every meaningful way, it has the will to strike itself out as an independent power and hold on to territory that it sees as vital to its conception of itself. Whereas Britain, despite the wealth and power, spends the entire century without a really solid conception of its future.
I completely agree with you, and I think this actually is a testament to the strength of the Estado Novo and Salazar in particular, because Britain didn't have, I don't believe it ever had, a core imperial vision. And what imperial provision was provided from below. Cecil Rhodes was the exception; he wasn't
very
the rule.
ad hoc.
But also, just in terms of a general overview of the empire, just to reinforce your point, I believe that from the Second Boer War was the fundamental turning point. After that, Britain went from a confident power into I would say, a craven power, in which it relied on international agreements to prevent essentially being overburdened by the excessive costs of managing the empire. So it went from, you can say, imperial defense into imperial survival after the Second Boer War. However, because there wasn't that central regime, that central head, that long-lasting vision, and those that did profess that vision were muddled, confused, and ultimately self-defeating, like Winston Churchill, Britain continued to take steps that accelerated that decline and resulted in the annihilation of the empire and the transfer of the hegemony of the global empire from Britain to the United States. And in contrast to that, you're completely right. I believe Portugal has that complete contrasting set of vision, and it is in contrast to these national humiliations. And that's in that sense, the Estado Novo represents the polar opposite to Britain, but also just emphasize this. You emphasize the idea of lacking prestige, lacking money, lacking power. The Portuguese Empire, despite being a minor nation, a third-rate international power on the periphery of the great power conflicts, was able to hold on to the majority of its empire long after Britain had completely abandoned virtually all of her colonies, save for Hong Kong.
Yes, the will to empire.
I mean, exactly, and I think that this is something that needs more attention. There's this, and again, I'm not trying to get too distracted from Portugal here, but there's this idea that I think by, as you say, the Second Boer War, the beginning of the 1900s, Britain has lost its way. It has no vision for what it actually is as a country, as a union, as an empire. This whole idea of the empire as a capital noun, as you say, it's a very late on addition to Britain's national story, to use that term. I don't believe the empire was really conquered by will, if that makes sense. I've had the view for some time that the empire was almost accidental. It was fundamentally, I think, a mercantile idea, or at least parts of where I'm being very.
And of course,
general.
when we're talking about the Brazilian Empire, it is a combination of all of these factors. It has been conceived in racial terms, it has been conceived in religious terms, and it has also been conceived in economic terms. But again, it eclipses the British Empire, because what did the British Empire attempt to do in the last stage of a real vision of empire? It was presented by Joseph Chamberlain, trying to present the idea of imperial customs, the Imperial Customs Union, the idea that Britain should transfer, in opposition to the United States and Germany, into a form of economic autarky, integrating the colonies into the British Empire and therefore excluding other foreign markets, and therefore they mutually reinforce each other. Portugal achieves that, and that is Salazar's fundamental vision for the economy, which Britain was never able to exert through the political will and the system at that time.
No.
So again, Portugal represents that political will which Britain, and that vision which Britain ultimately lacked. And again, this has fundamentally more questions to sort of associate with it. My view is that Portugal fundamentally won the colonial wars. Despite the fact that Portugal had to rely on excessive conscription, the fact that Portugal had to end up employing so many natives in the army, again, it fundamentally changed the nature of the Portuguese empire and brought it closer to this vision, you could say, of Luso-tropicalism. And effectively, in Mozambique and Angola, there were only minor guerrilla movements left. The only province which was, paralyzed by the war was Guinea-Bissau, which was receiving, direct support from the Soviet Union. But as you can see on this map, Guinea-Bissau, which is next to the Gambia and Senegal, it says 1974, is the smallest and most irrelevant of all of the provinces. And of course, the prize is Angola because of the oil, and to a less extent Mozambique. And that's reflected in the economic disparity between these two regions today. And so
there's some uranium there as well.
Yeah. So despite this, Portugal is able to hold on to effectively, it's similar to what happened in France and Algeria. The French were able to hold on to Algeria. They were able to win the conflict virtually militarily. But again, it was a lack of political will to ensure that the imperial conquest existed. And of course, when de Gaulle came to power, he believed an enduring colonial empire would only weaken France's position vis-a-vis the United States and Europe, and allow the United States to continually subvert the empire. Yeah. However, for Portugal, the continuation of the colonial empire is that much more important than France, because France can easily get rid of all our colonies and remain, with Germany divided, the most powerful nation in Europe, whereas Portugal, again, needs the colonies to remain relevant, at least in the view of Salazar.
It's interesting you mentioned your idea that Portugal fundamentally won the colonial war. Somebody in the chat has John, not real name, has used the analogy of a stalemate. If you think about it like a chess game, I think a good analogy might be that Portugal played the chess game of the colonial war to a stalemate, as opposed to just surrendering the board like the UK and France did.
Yes, but consider the opposition it's against. It has international condemnation, sanctions, and is facing insurgencies. And we're talking about Portugal. We're not talking about a major European power that can buttress and hold on to these vast territories. And yet they do. But again, the implications of this, when we finally have the Carnation Revolution, I want to get to my conspiracy theory at the end. But the reason this is all fascinating is that Portugal wins the war effectively. Then a clique of the captains removes the Estado Novo from power, and there fall Mozambique and Angola. And Angola in particular becomes hardline Marxist-Leninist.
Yes.
Thereafter, the dominoes begin to fall. Rhodesia will fall in the next 5 years, and in the next couple of decades, so will South Africa, and by extension, Namibia, which was then controlled by South Africa. So this is fundamental, I think, in terms of understanding the whole nature of the political system in the entirety of South Africa. I mean, the only area which was actually given self-rule, i.e. native rule, was Bechuanaland, which was reconceived as Botswana in this entire area. So as a result of this, the entire political landscape of Africa is changed irrevocably. This isn't some peripheral concern of a dying empire fading into irrelevance. This affects the entire fate of South Africa. Greater South Africa,
much for the worse. I mean, you think of the condition of what is now Zimbabwe, Angola, Mozambique, and South Africa itself. I mean, it's tragic. The downfall of what these places once were to what they are now. I mean, you're completely right. And this will that Portugal is not just a peripheral vassal of great powers, that it will be a sovereign power and it will have a say in its own destiny, is a very, very powerful idea. And as you say, it allows what is otherwise a kind of peripheral minor power to go on controlling these vast stretches of territory, which are vital to the balance of the region. As you say, the dominoes fall once they're gone.
Yes,
nevertheless, yes, sorry, Hitman.
A point I wanted to make is I think the reason Portugal is able to have this will is because essentially it's a dictatorial system. So Salazar's got the will to keep fighting, whereas Britain and France are fundamentally democratic parliamentary systems. So leaders or politicians come and go, there's disagreements, so they just can't maintain.
Could I point out though? I think there's a difference between France and Britain. With France, France loses militarily as a result of the Second World War. It is in a much weaker position comparatively than Great Britain. It attempts to reconquer its colonies unsuccessfully in the Far East and successfully in the case of Africa. And when de Gaulle comes into power, to me, it's kind of like Napoleon surrendering Louisiana. He doesn't believe it's fundamental to French interests and will simply act as a waste of resources. So he's reconsolidating on the European core. With Britain, it's different because the empire is that much more of an inseparable legacy combined with that of the relations with the dominions as well.
Yes. And I mean, it's also, I mean, it's odd because there are periods, especially when Churchill comes back into power in the early 50s, where Britain has this streak of actually very efficiently dealing with colonial unrest. It puts down the Malayan emergency. It puts down the Mau Mau in Kenya. And there are other examples too, I believe, various insurgencies out east. And for a while, it seems to stabilize. And then come the 1960s, the major wave of decolonization ensues all over Africa, especially. So, I mean, it's odd because I think there was a kind of momentary will to hold on and try and preserve a sense of Britain's greatness. And I think Suez basically comes and shatters all that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if possible, just before we get to the Carnation Revolution, I want to talk about the Changing of the Guard, in particular one aspect which is so bizarre, I have to get both your opinions on. So Salazar, again, like Franco, he lives effectively to the end of, and effectively the entire government is presided throughout his entire life, and he doesn't get overthrown during his lifetime like a Pedro II to Brazil. However, he suffers from a cerebral hemorrhage at the age of 79, and he's put into a coma for a few months. During this time, it's expected that he wasn't going to recover and is dismissed by President Tomas to be replaced by one of his sort of great political proteges who was seen as a contender for power in the 1950s, Marcelo Caetano, who was effectively the presidency minister under Lopez. Effectively, he was there to control what Salazar believed was the errant president in the form of Lopez. Nevertheless, Salazar recovers to everyone's shock, and he regains lucidity. And then we have one of the most bizarre iterations in history, where during the remainder of his life, because he will live for another 2 years, people indulge him in this idea of private rule, whereby no one tells him that he's formally been deposed. They don't move him into a new residence. And everyone goes along with this idea that Salazar is still the Prime Minister of Portugal, despite having been out of office for 2 years.
That would be a wonderful comedy film, wouldn't it? You could have a kind of death of Stalin. Have you ever seen a film called Goodbye Lenin?
Yes.
We're in East German student tries to pretend to his mother that Germany's still going,
and it results in increasingly outlandish things. And then she's seen, say, for example, a statue of Lenin,
giant statue of Lenin flying
a
down the
Coca-Cola
street,
banner
like
being
Superman.
pushed against her building. Yes, it's wonderful.
Yes.
And he comes up with this newsreel, this invented newsreel to try and contextualize
fake
this.
TV broadcast.
And in the end, he has to make out that the East Germans actually won the Cold War in order to justify all of this.
Yes, that's right. Well, so I actually have a question for you, AM, and I've been waiting for this ever since we argued somewhat about Salazar's attitude to the monarchy, because I'm of the opinion that the perfect moment to restore the monarchy would have been under Setano, right after the death of Salazar, or at least the end of Salazar's rule. I'm of the opinion that would have been the perfect moment to do it and kick some life back into.
And I'm of the opinion that was politically impossible, because Salazar had complete control over the regime based on his technocratic expertise in a way that Setano did not. And Tomas did not want to be removed from power, which is what, and he, again, when we talk about Setano Tomas, we have to talk about dualism, i.e. tentative collaboration between a president who very reluctantly accepts Setano and his idea of the continual evolution or limited reforms. Whereas in the case of Salazar, we see a man with almost complete political power and the death of his political protege, who was the only thing holding him back. And I believe 1951 was the only chance where he feasibly could have ushered in a return to the monarchy. I don't believe it would have been possible, not least because Tommaso would never accept being removed as head of state and wasn't in the position. Marcello Setano was not in a position to exercise that control.
I have to say, I agree more with AM than Panama. Sorry.
I mean, okay. I accept that politically you're in a sticky situation there if you're going to try to do a restoration, but just, I mean,
to put this in perspective, Panama,
yes.
The time between 1968 and 1947 is really the only time in the entire life of the regime that the presidency had any independent will since the national dictatorship.
I see. So you're saying that the monarchical restoration has to happen during the days of Salazar as prime minister?
Well, particularly after Cumana dies, because again, he owes almost like a vassal relationship to Cumana, because he establishes the new regime and he is effectively the uncrowned king of Portugal and reigns for life. When he dies, because there is no sort of democratic trappings or constitutional vestiges associated with him, he became leader during a coup. There was no sort of, even though he was nominally elected, he was always elected without any contest to him. He was effectively a king in all but name. So therefore, restoring the monarchy there would have no sort of negative implications whatsoever. Whereas in appointing a successor to him, and then getting in another election in a series of contested elections, 1958 in particular, we add to this idea of a national director or national president who is in some way wedded to this idea of a republican constitution attached to the Estado Novo, in which I don't believe existed until 1951. And I believe fundamentally Salazar made a choice to make the regime more republican when he could have opted for monarchy instead. Because like I say, Cumana does not fit into this role of a republican president to me. He was a military strongman who adopted this vassal liege relationship to Salazar. And that was the exception, not the rule.
I'll take that.
But what do you think about the 2-year private rule? Are you convinced that it actually happened? Because I'm not.
I don't really believe it was possible in the kind of cartoonish way that it's often held up to be. I think that at that point, well, I mean, to be fair, Franco was pretty cogent all the way up to the end. But I can see that when you have somebody that old and that essentially decrepit in the office of essentially dictator, you're going to run into problems, and they begin to kind of drift out of reality, don't they? And I don't mean that in the sense of the mind. I mean that I mean that the functions of the state begin to almost without their control, drift away from them. And sort of power begins to spring up around them rather than from them, I think. So yes, I think there probably was this period where Salazar was kind of living in one reality and the state was living in another one. I mean, this picture here, it's kind of hard not to smile because it looks like it looks like a sort of birthday party for an old uncle or something. You know, I mean, you know,
Yes, very
with him
good.
there in his dressing gown and all these students with gowns on. It's rather surreal, isn't it?
It is.
It's a surreal thing. I mean, this is one of the issues with technocratic government for life, I suppose, is that you have to think of what to do when the leader begins to, you know, show the effects of age, I suppose.
I think my question is just how on earth could he be convinced by this unless his mind was half gone? I mean, you can't go from fundamentally reorganizing the colonial policy of Portugal one day to being completely unaware that you're out of power whilst you're also fighting a protracted colonial war.
Well, I mean, to be fair, what is the actual physical function of power? I imagine that he is essentially in the palace or in some sort of residence. He's being told information and handed pieces of paper. He makes decisions, and those pieces of paper get taken away, and then you repeat the next day. I mean, I don't think it would be that hard to give somebody the illusion that they're doing important things, if that's the function of their power.
I think what you and I need to do is we need to go back and we need to research this in every detail, and then we need to and then we need to crowdfund a film for it. I'm sorry,
it would be wonderful.
It's impossible that this film has not already been made before.
Can we get Armando Iannucci to direct, though?
Yes,
maybe. I don't see why not. All right, but there'll probably be a lot less swearing. I mean, I'm not sure how you make it into a Tucker-esque scenario where you have the figure going around just shouting obscenities at everyone and compelling everyone into submission.
You pick one of the figures who was becoming dominant at this period, and you essentially turn them into the de facto head of state when everybody is still paying court to King Salazar, essentially, who's this increasingly mercurial old man in a bath chair who kind of is entertaining sort of grand geopolitical illusions about the nature of the war in Africa, say, when everybody else is talking about how
do you remember that scene in Death of Stalin where it's actually real, where Stalin is pointing to the image of the lamb, and they're going off wonderfully, you know, I am the lamb, and you know, he goes and says maybe all maybe you're the tit, etc. Yes, well, effectively the film would just be that, you know,
the lamb is socialism.
The lamb is socialism. Well, no, socialism is the milk.
Socialism is the milk. The lamb is the people.
Anyway, we'll go on to Caetano briefly, because under Caetano we see he's not an incompetent sort of figurehead who just passes over. He is competent. He has his own vision. We see an attempt to seriously exploit oil reserves. I mean, Portugal, vast unproven oil reserves, you know, of Sao Tome and of course Angola. And indeed, as an extension of this policy of autarky, Portugal would also process its own oil at the same time with, I believe, refineries built in the city of Sines, only for the economy to come crashing down with the 1973 oil crisis. So again, this is sort of things that are beyond Portuguese control, which also facilitate in rapid inflation, which culminate in the crisis at the end of 1973 and 1974. But again, I talked to you earlier about the idea of this dualism between Tomás and Caetano, the idea that Tomás was not prepared to assume only the nominal powers of the presidency. Effectively, he grasped onto his real constitutional power, which had been held in temporary abeyance, while Salazar was, you know, the autocrat of Portugal. And Caetano attempts to begin some sort of bridge towards political opposition, counteracting the idea that Portugal has transcended politics, or there are no individual political factions. And I think it's the only time during the Estado Novo when in the 1969 election, there was like 11% cast for an opposition party. And again, that horrifies Thomas to such an extent that in the next election in 1973, again, the National Union is the only party allowed to stand in the legislative elections. So Caetano arguably could have gone further in this idea of the evolution and continuity, trying to preserve the essence of the structure of the regime while tweaking it in order to make it, you can say, not just acceptable to a increasingly restless population of Portugal, which is suffering under economic hardship, but is also being conscripted, but also in the face of international opposition as well. Because again, like Spain, the regime has to adapt and ostensibly liberalize on the surface in order to be amenable to its international backers, but in reality, the nations who are willing to subvert it and destroy it and support color revolution, as we saw with JFK. So effectively, I believe that the Estado Novo retained its fundamental character. Maybe it's a testament to Salazar that despite not having restored the monarchy, the regime was able to outlast him and outlast this bizarre phase of 2-year private rule. Nevertheless, we have to also address the idea of Portugal spending excessive amounts of money and the increasing sort of pile up of bodies when it comes to the international conflict, the colonial wars coming to the Carnation Revolution. And this is my theory. During the colonial wars, of course, Portuguese men had to be drafted into overseas service. They were drafted for periods of 4 years, and they would spend 2 years out in tours of Africa, which of course was so horrifying to most people that they would rather leave the country than serve in Africa. At the same time, Caetano was attempting to reform the army to bring costs down, per the example of Rhodesia, reformulating the idea of a continual counterinsurgency, holding on to the main provinces of Angola and Mozambique while Bissau was basically lost, whilst promoting auxiliaries, or basically the irregulars, the indigenous army and the previously segregated army, to be fast-tracked into the professional Portuguese officer corps. So this is my idea. So consider the notion that the war had effectively been won. This would also mean the end of the draft and the cutting down of the vast military state apparatus. As a result of that, you suddenly have a lot of young men who aren't going to be conscripted, and thus a huge lack of public sympathy for any potential uprising, now that the regime has effectively dealt with this problem. Also consider the fact that these reforms would have meant a lusotropical, multiracial officer corps for Portugal transcending from being Portugal as we know it into a truly pluricontinental nation forced on it through the experience of the colonial wars. Now consider the parallel one can draw to the 1820s and Brazilian particularism, i.e. Brazil and Portugal's relationship, the idea that Portugal would not countenance a relationship in which they were the junior partner under Brazil. So the fact that Portugal would rather do away with Brazil and the greatest portion of its empire rather than being dominated by its empire. So in this case, we see Portugal, which again, relatively is, you can say, Mozambique and Angola. And indeed, the economies of Mozambique and Angola will eventually, ultimately, eclipse that of mainland Portugal. And so we see almost a recreation of this Brazilian situation in which the non-Brazilian, the African elements of the pluricontinental nation will supersede that, combined with the prospect of the success in the wars and what that would mean to a potential Soviet-backed, leftist-backed counterinsurgency. The Carnation Revolution, therefore, the result of the captains, was a defense of that privileged position of the Brazilian officer corps. It was a defense of the idea of a small Portugal against the lusotropical vision of Salazar, and continued with Caetano. It was also perhaps the last time that they could seriously have called achieve this coup with massive public sympathy at the time that conscription was being reorganized into this low-key counterinsurgency movement. What do you think about that?
No, I agree with you, especially when you compare it to the previous incident with Brazil. It kind of makes sense. You don't want to become eclipsed in your own country, essentially.
Well, I certainly would ascribe to that view over the mainstream, sickening, sweet, liberal view of the regime fell because they put flowers in the rifles. I mean, just it's
Yeah.
the kind of regime story of Portugal. Of the end of the Estado Novo is absurd. This whole idea that it was a like all these ideas of popular revolutions from below. It never happens that way. Never how it goes down. So I've never believed that. So I'd certainly be willing to believe that as an idea. My main reading on this comes from heavy research into Antonio de Spinola, who I find a very interesting character. And I think one of the kind of tragic figures of this period for what happens to him. I mean, yes, essentially, I'd say that's the most plausible explanation for the Carnation Revolution. Though, I mean, had it not happened, what do you how do you rate the chances of the Estado Novo? Because I'm always having debates with people about the legacy of Franco's Spain, where they say, well, if only this and this, if only it had been a different candidate for the throne, if only this politician had done this differently, if only this or that, then the regime would still be around. As if we'd still have authoritarian Bourbon post-Franco Spain right now. And you have to think, well, I mean, would we? Would we have? Could that regime survive international pressure to become a plutocratic liberal democracy like every other country in the Western world? I mean, what were the chances of the Estado Novo without the revolution that happened, do you think, Graham?
I want to offer a slightly to approach that from a slightly different angle. I talked about the idea that the Reconquista, Lusotropicalism, the idea of Portugal's unique path in colonial affairs was tagged on in order to provide intellectual context in opposition to Black nationalism. However, I believe that the colonial wars and the fact that Portugal ultimately won them, and the fact that so many young men were conscripted and had served in the colonial wars, acted as a form of baptism of fire. If anything, it represented some form of revolution in the idea of Portugal itself. And so I see the Carnation Revolution less as a revolution and more as a reaction against that idea. Okay. The idea that they were rescuing an old idea of Portugal, reliant back on the Republican example, and that had this been allowed to continue, had Caetano's reforms been allowed to succeed, as they probably would have, then it is possible that, again, how does one actually view democracy when one has actually achieved the status of being pluricontinental? It becomes like the Reichsrat in Cisleithania in Austria. It becomes ungovernable. So if anything, the pluricontinental nature of Portugal, this multinational constituency, would entrench the policy of the Estado Novo and not detract from it. Whereas when you get rid of the colonial empire, suddenly a return to the republic and democracy seems all that more plausible.
Yeah, no, I agree wholeheartedly.
Okay, I see. So essentially, the Estado Novo became defined by its colonial policy.
Yes, yeah. And I believe that to be against the colonial policy, I mean, effectively, to be against the war was to be against the Estado Novo. Yes. And that is why the MFA believed that a military coup was the only means to achieve an end to the war. But why did they want an end to the war? And I put forward my thesis.
And that's your idea.
Yeah, so the Estado Novo and the war were inseparable. And you couldn't have the Estado Novo without the colonial empire.
It always struck me as odd because Spinola, for example, like many others, was a career Africanist, to use the Spanish term. He had, I believe, been a soldier in Africa for most of his career, and especially as he climbed the ranks, the higher he got, I think by the end he was commander in chief in Angola, and it always struck me as odd that men who had fought so hard and put their lives at risk for the preservation of the Portuguese Empire came home and basically overthrew the government they had fought for. It never really made sense to me, but this theory you put forward does rationalize it. certainly.
I also think Spinola in particular is fascinating because he had instant regret having done that. I mean, just to summarize, like what happens here, just so the audience can understand what we're talking about. So we have the Revolution of the Captains, we have the MFA, which again ostensibly is anti-war, but really it involves a large cabal of leftists, communist sympathizers, Marxist-Leninists, support from the Soviet Union, etc. Ostensibly, they're surrounded around the 3Ds: democracy, decolonization, and there's a rather nebulous conception of development, but really the first two are key: democracy and decolonization, because both are anathema to the Estado Novo and would mean and entail ultimately its dissolution and replacement with a new government entirely. There was a failed MFA attempt to capture Lisbon a couple of months before the successful one on the 25th of April 1974, which is the so-called Carnation Revolution. However, it wasn't a complete revolution in the sense that it represented a definitive break from power. Rather, Caetano would only hand over power to one of their number, who again, it was only tentatively supported of the movement and acted as some sort of go-between between the government, who was Spinola. And so Spinola was installed after Tomas resigned as the new president. And again, having supported the anti-war cause, he quickly supported what he called the silent majority, or the conservative elements of Portugal, believing that he, as this basically interim president between regimes of the new Portugal and the old Portugal, could arrest or hold on to some aspect of the Estado Novo. And when it proved that the radical elements in the army were far more powerful than he was, he effectively is chased out of the country, flees to Brazil, and begins to lead his own attempts at counterinsurgency against the leftist government. And the leftists, I mean, they achieve everything that, he was fearful of and demonstrate that he was true. And the fact that he was probably, ill-conceived support of the MFA and this idea of democracy, decolonization, leftism, and this idea of a Brazilian color revolution, because of course it directly supported the Soviet Union in the sense that Angola immediately became a Marxist-Leninist state and went over and even had, I believe, Cuban backing at some point. But Otto Pohl would know better than I do. So what is Portugal after the Carnation Revolution? Well, the MFA form a junta, because of course it's Spanish Portuguese, sorry. We see the technical restoration of elections. And again, in the first elections, there is no right-wing party. One of the parties later becomes right-wing in the next elections, albeit for the next 4 years from 1976 until 1980, Portugal is a democracy with a constitution dedicated to achieving real socialism, with party politics held under the guardianship of the military. And with the guardianship of the military, we see extensive land reform and nationalizations throughout the country. Again, you can almost say completing the process which the original Republicans didn't have the political power to enact back in the late 1910s and 1920s. So if anything, I believe that Spinola was completely justified in his fears and his instant regret for having supported this movement and the effect this would have on the right in Portugal.
I think that the line that comes to mind is what Porfirio Diaz said after he was overthrown after decades of rule in Mexico and was on a boat heading into exile. And Francisco Madero, who had just taken power after the revolution, Diaz said, Madero has released the tiger. Now let us see if he can control it. Of course, Madero was gunned down, I think, days after taking power. And I think the same thing about Spinola. It's okay. You've released the tiger that has been kept down by technocratic rule for decades. Can you control it? No, basically.
I think the sad thing I have to leave this discussion on really is that Salazar, I believe, was right in believing that his policies regarding not just domestic policies, but regarding the nature of the government and the nature of the foreign policy were essential in terms of keeping Portugal relevant. And I believe the key legacy of the Carnation Revolution has been in making Portugal irrelevant.
Yes.
And nothing more than a bystander in perpetuity in international affairs.
It's gone back to being a tiny periphery on the edge of Europe that
if anything, it's more relevant now than it has been in the last 700 years.
Absolutely.
Which is quite saying. And again, looking at this map and the extent of the Portuguese Empire, it's interesting to consider that Timor, you can see here, next to Indonesia. What was it? Suharto waited until after the Estado Novo regime collapsed in order to invade. It wasn't like Nehru in India. He gave the government the indignity and waited until it became independent before he tried to annex it. And as we see on this map, the last vestige of Portuguese power, as with Hong Kong, is ceded to China in 1999 in the form of Macau. But yes, that's the rather depressing note I want to leave on in terms of what Salazar represented and the effects of dismantling his legacy.
So could I put it to you once more again, and I want to take Spain into consideration as well. Do you see any route to survive? I'm aware that we've established now that the Estado Novo is very much tied to its African policy. But do you see any route to survival for these corporatist authoritarian regimes to, say, the year 2000?
As in, would Spain have succeeded? Okay, so would like I said, with Portugal, I believe it could feasibly have existed. I mean, there's even the possibility that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but again, we have to consider the whole political landscape of South Africa, the greater South Africa, not just the country, is fundamentally changed as a result of this. What would have happened as a result of this? Arguably, you could say the Soviet Union would have collapsed sooner had this not happened. But as for Spain, my view is always that Franco drained Spain of a alternative vision outside of Franco himself. And I believe that he believed foolishly that Juan Carlos, having grown up in the new Spain, the national Catholic Spain, would be inclined to preserve it, having no memories of what preceded it. And of course, he proceeded to do the exact opposite. And again, the legacy of the intellectual bankruptcy of Spain is the fact that when Francoist parties were actually put up in election, they were easily annihilated, and very quickly socialists were back in power. Yes. However, I think the Estado Novo is different in the sense, like I said, Salazar successfully was able to contrive, despite the lack of the restoration of the monarchy, he was able to contrive a situation where, despite his own sort of lack of awareness or his own sort of incapacity, inexplicably, the system he created was able to create a possible future, which was ultimately denied in a fluke, which was the Carnation Revolution.
Well, again, I don't want to push this too much further, but I'm hoping you can kind of set me right on this, because I've always had this creeping instinct, and I'm going to use this word that is rightfully loathed by good historians, I think, which is inevitability. I have this instinct, essentially, that let's say Juan Carlos had been the successor Franco wanted and had determined to carry on authoritarian corporative Spain, for the foreseeable future. Even so, I just have this sense that a regime like that, surrounded by liberal plutocracies, with enormous pressure from the outside, simply can't survive. That one way or another, the regime, if we want to call it that, of Western Europe simply won't tolerate alternative states within its remit.
Yeah,
well, I mean, the more depressing sort of thing I would contrast is there were certain states that were tolerated in Africa, in particular, because of the Cold War.
Yes.
When the Cold War ended and they ceased to be relevant, they were annihilated. I think the most clear example of this, the most pertinent for the audience, would be Yugoslavia. When it ceased to be that fundamental conduit between East and West, occupying that fundamental strategic point, when that strategic point was no longer, Yugoslavia was simply dispensed with. This also existed in Africa, when you have, Zaire is probably the best example of this. When Mobutu Sese Seko left, the legacy of that, again, resulted in what was even called the African World War, in terms of the devastation and the loss there.
War, which is still technically ongoing.
So it is possible that with Spain in particular, had Juan Carlos been the intended heir, that the Americans may have attempted after the fall of the Soviet Union to aggressively attempt Spanish assimilation into the European Union.
As in just blatant, like force pressure, essentially.
All it would take would be one slip up from the Spanish government, like we see with the Carnation Revolution, to create the conditions whereby a democratic opposition, quote unquote, could arise to take power in the name of the United States and the European Union in the guise of democracy.
Looking back from now and in the span of our particular lives, I would say, or at least this is how it seems to me. You may not agree. The most powerful weapons that the United States and the regime of Western Europe has been the narrative, more than anything else. The ability to control the narrative, the ability to establish as a fact that the Carnation Revolution was a load of peace-loving youth putting flowers into rifles that brought down an evil, oppressive, technocratic regime, or the
fascist, not technocratic. They wouldn't concede that word.
Yes. The narrative around civil rights in America, or the restoration of so-called democracy in Spain, or any of it's the power to set the narrative to whatever they want. And I agree that as you say, all it takes is one slip up from an enemy. All it takes is they could just demonize the Spanish states as long as they needed to, for it to just collapse under its own weight at that point, as you say. I mean, I think, as I said, I think that's the most terrifying weapon of the regime, that it seems to me, is this ability to decide the narrative, even in the countries themselves.
And to be very topical, and to end this conversation before I move into super chats, that is what we're seeing with Russia. Push to the maximum. What I basically described with Spain. So it is ongoing. It's not a theoretical abstract proposition. It is an actuality, which we are currently all living through. All right, thank you, everyone. I think unless you have any sort of last final points on the rise and fall of the Estado Novo, I'd like to move on to the super chats.
I think we more or less covered it.
Yeah,
I haven't had any more.
Pretty thorough.
All right, thank you. Lord Kevin for $10. Thank you very much. Good stream as always, gentlemen. Any chance of a comparison stream on based Brazilian integralism or the Standestat? Also, Apostolic Majesty, please come to Brazil. Oh, I'm not very fond of getting on a plane and traveling at the moment, Lord Kevin. Thank you. But I mean, I travel to Europe. I tend to go by train. As for a comparison between Brazilian and the Portuguese, that was actually an original idea for this stream. But I think as you can probably empathize with us, we already went 3.5 hours just discussing Portugal and discussing its direct colonial legacy with that of its colonial counterparts. Imagine how long this stream would be if we compared Salazar to Vargas.
I also think that the Estado Novos plural in either country are just too different to compare. They're not similar regimes in any way, really. My argument is that Vargas was the Brazilian FDR, or that FDR was the American Vargas. Essentially, they both take large American nations and essentially, I suppose, statify them would be the term, and create these gigantic, not really welfare states, but just states that totally change the character of life in those countries and endure to this day, would be my argument.
Yes, and I also would like to discuss Peronism at a later point, and maybe
that would be wonderful.
Maybe a comparison of Latin American regimes would be more pertinent to discuss. I mean, we did do a little bit of comparison because Brazil is an offshoot, obviously, of Portugal, but I think we carried it as far as was necessary. And like I said, I brought back my ultimate link between the Carnation Revolution and the Brazilian War of Independence. I'd like to think that's an original thought. I'm sure it isn't, but maybe it is.
It's very canny though. I gave a lecture, quite a long one, ostensibly on Perón, but which ended up covering Juan Manuel de Rosas and Argentine history up to him about 2 months ago now. Unfortunately, it was not recorded, much to my annoyance, because I thought it was. So that would be a good topic because I still have a lot of knowledge fresh. But yes, in particular, Getulio Vargas, and I think the Brazilian military dictatorship, which went well into the 80s, would be a good one to cover. Because I think, it ties into what you were saying about America's willingness to tolerate authoritarian regimes, depend on, essentially for purposes of the Cold War, for it just not being willing to allow Brazil to flip red, so to speak. Which, to be fair, I don't think it ever really was in as much danger of doing as the Americans would have had it. So, but
Mombasa Timmy for $9 New Zealand. Thank you very much. Great stream. What countries could conceivably have adopted the Estado Novo concept, or was it only ever able to be a simply Portuguese anomaly? It was a Portuguese anomaly in terms of the pluricontinentalism, which we've talked about ad nauseum. But regarding the idea of corporatism, like I said, it was actually a rather common political system in the interwar period, before it was eclipsed by communism, National Socialism, and Western Anglo-American style democracy. But I do believe the colonial aspect of the Estado Novo does make it unique. And like I said, one can't imagine the Estado Novo sans the policy, because again, it's not just enough for Portugal to be corporatist. Portugal needs to be sovereign, and in order to be sovereign, Portugal needs to wield tangible power, and it wields it through the integration of its colonies.
I would also add that in particular, Portugal, or I should say Salazar, had great luck in coming to power at a time when he could essentially work from a blank slate politically, that he wasn't tied to a special legacy upon coming to power. That as we covered, the Republic and the monarchy and all the various factions had essentially discredited themselves or been discredited.
Do you know what the irony is? Just to point this out, I think this idea of government in terms of its longevity and it being able to resist foreign subversion would have perhaps existed in that temporary structure we see when the Portuguese royal family were based out in Rio de Janeiro. I think an empire of this nature, this lusotropical, multiracial, pluricontinental empire, would be much better served based in Brazil rather than in Portugal, because as we say, Portugal is too small an imperial center in order to really act as the center. And like I said, with the Carnation Revolution and the Brazilian War of Independence, Portugal seems to be rebelling against that idea.
Well, sorry, go on, Hitman.
Freire, the guy who came up with the idea, was Brazilian anyway, so it seems natural.
Yes, it's an extension of that shared history and the legacy of Brazilian colonization. So to me, it seems natural that Brazil would be the center of it, not Portugal.
I would also make the argument that, to an extent, the constitution of the Empire of Brazil under Pedro II did fulfill that dream somewhat before it was envisaged. I would argue that, and this is something I would love to do a stream on one day, is that I would argue that the political system that evolved under Pedro II was one of those rare political miracles of the modern world, which, for a time at least, struck a remarkably good balance between monarchism, Catholicism, parliamentarianism, and regionalism, essentially. But as I said, it was for a short time only.
John Boy for €10. Thanks for a fascinating stream. Well, thank you very much. John Gordon for $10. Thank you. Is it safe to assume Portugal ran Angola and Mozambique more efficiently than they are run today? Portugal seems quite benevolent compared to other colonial powers. Well, like answering, was it better to live under Ian Smith than it was under Robert Mugabe? I don't really think that's a question we can answer earnestly on this platform, I'm afraid.
You have to make up your own mind on that one.
Yes, I'm sure you can infer something from what we're talking about, but unfortunately we can't go out and say it. Rafael Iglesias de Figueiredo. So yes, we were able to find some Portuguese in the chat miraculously. Happy to see my country here. Are you of the opinion that the Vatican II changed the perspective that the Church had of the Estado Novo? Absolutely.
I think we covered that, didn't we?
And fundamentally, I think that post-Vatican II in the 1960s, Paul VI viewed the Estado Novo as an embarrassment on the way that they wanted to take the Catholic Church. So, yeah, it wasn't good for the Estado Novo. Juan Cigaron for $5. Considering how feckless Juan Carlos I was, maybe not having a monarchist restoration was a blessing in disguise, possibly. But again,
this is the point I was making.
Yes, I know, possibly. But the reason I bring that up, though, is because of the Miguelist tradition of that branch of the Braganza family. It would be in the same way that the Carlists, before being utterly gutted and dispossessed of their central leadership, were fundamentally not just reactionaries, but more hardline than Action Française, and had a greater tradition than that.
Maybe this is reaching, but I would still make the argument, at least, that I reckon you could take a hardline member of the Carlist branch of Spanish royalty, and it's one thing to be a kind of Carlist militant talking about how great you want Spain to be in your particular respect, but you put that person at the head of Spain, and I think that very quickly they may turn into a Juan Carlos.
Well, the example I use is actually Louis XVI. Louis XVI, despite being the mainline representative of the legitimist or the Bourbon dynasty, with its grand legacy with Louis XIV, Louis Grand, ultimately meekly adopted the trappings of being a citizen king. So anything is possible regarding the individual character of the monarch, unfortunately. All I can, again, do is appeal to these traditions, and ultimately one can only go so far as this is engaging in counterfactual history. Albeit the reason I'm using this hypothetical is to try and characterize Salazar's own personal intentions and his own ideology, which my view is definitely founded on pragmatism and Portuguese greatness, but by extension, the extension of his own personal rule or autocracy. AJSJ for $5. How deeply embedded were Jesuit missionaries within early Portuguese colonies? Well, I mean, you're an expert in Paraguay, Panama. Do you want to talk about the extent? I mean, not just in Portuguese colonies, but throughout all of Latin America and Mexico as well.
It's an I mean, I don't think that the person who asked the question is quite aware of the rabbit hole they've opened up there, because it's an enormously complicated thing. The status of the Jesuits specifically as Christian missionaries. You mentioned Paraguay. The interesting thing about Paraguay is that it was essentially a Jesuit colony.
Which is why I brought it up.
Yes, well, it was founded almost entirely by Jesuits, and I believe it has the highest concentration of Jesuit reductions, which are essentially monasteries that they founded, which were kind of they were kind of monastery camps where a church would be established and all the natives would have to come and live around it. And be Christianized and work essentially in return for access to the various amenities. So Jesuits in Brazil were a presence early on, but I don't know specifically what their status was. There are quite a few Jesuit reductions in the south of Brazil, the ruins of them now. So there was certainly a Jesuit presence, as there was in pretty much all the Latin colonization efforts, but specifically the Spanish Jesuit influence was much higher, and throughout the colonial period there were several expulsions of the Jesuits from Spanish colonies. Because they were unruly. I know that also in 1932, I think, Manuel Azaña in Spain under the Republic expels the Jesuits in a very kind of in a move very much reminiscent of previous Spanish kings, shall we say?
Well, I mean, the Portuguese just did it a couple of decades earlier.
Yes,
I do seem it remarkable how the Spanish basically recreate almost down to every detail everything that the Republicans tried to do in Portugal just 2 decades later.
But they
I just
didn't
find
learn.
that remarkable, and they never
They
learned.
didn't
They
learn
did
the lessons.
no,
Well,
and had
this
the
is
same response.
Again, I did cover this quite in depth on the stream with Turnip, and I'd like to cover it again one day, perhaps on this channel. But and I don't want to get too much into it now. But the incredible thing about the Republic and the reason it failed in Spain, despite significant support from the populace, is that the Republican leaders refused to let it be a republic because they would meddle. And whenever it seemed like conservative or right-wing forces were gaining power, it was decided that they couldn't be trusted and had to be shut down. So they established a republic and then refused to let it be one, essentially.
Does that remind you of anything?
Yes. Well, this was the whole nexus of the stream with Turnip. It was trying to compare certain actions of a certain modern state which lies between Mexico and Canada and the regime of 1931.
Well, fascinating. Well, that's it for the super chats. Thank you, everyone who sent one. All I can say is, Hitman, anything you would like to shill or would like to say before we leave tonight?
Well, thank you for having me on, AM. It's always a pleasure. In terms of shilling, you can follow me on Twitter at Hitman49441. I also have a channel with some discussions on it, which you can watch. I have 2 with Columba, one looking at historical themes in June. The other one is looking at Roman satire. I also have 2 with Marcus, where we're sort of looking at the work of General JFC Fuller and how his military thought can be applied to the war in Ukraine.
Fantastic. Panama, anything you would like to say?
No, not really. Head over to my channel. Follow me on Twitter at VerseByHat for anything that I'm doing. That's pretty much it. Nothing special at the moment to promote.
All right. Well, if you enjoyed this video, please like and leave a comment. It helps the channel out a lot. To see more content like this, subscribe to Apostolic Majesty. If you want to support the channel and gain access to members-only content, please consider becoming a channel member. There is also a Discord, which I think I've linked in the description. I might have forgotten, but you'll find it on other videos. Anyway, thank you everyone for watching. Thank you to my wonderful guests, and good night.